right. I would like to welcome everyone for the second meeting of Economic Policy, Papers on European and Global Issues, as we call EPPG. And let me start, of course, apologizing for the hot logistics, not working ACs everywhere, but I think we are in the improvement phase. And I'm thinking on the positive, and this will lead intense economic debate on this issue of globalization and fiscal populism. As you know, it's a timeless topic, actually. And we have 4 great papers, 2 days, a fantastic panel at the end, all of which is going to make us think deeper about these issues. And for those of you who are new to our gathering, this is the second event of EPPG. The first one was in Paris last December. And the idea here is to bring the debate on international issues to economic policy. So this is the new format of economic policy. That's why the name is changed, with the goal of reaching something like Brookings Papers on Economic Activity, where our focus is going to be, as I said, international. And of course, international issues are European and global, which is what our name is about. And having said that, I'm going to leave the floor to Clemens to make some announcement and start the meeting.
Okay, great. Thank you. So hello everyone. My name is Clemens Fuß. I'm the director of CESifo, and it's a pleasure really to welcome you all here, also in the name of my co-chairs, Moritz Schullerich, who unfortunately had to cancel. He also wanted to be here, and Charles Wüplosch. Before we start with the first session, I have some kind of minor housekeeping points. First of all, the Venice International University has informed us that the air conditioning unfortunately has been damaged by some event. They are trying to repair it, but it seems to be something complicated. So in some room it does work, and in some rooms it doesn't. We apologize about that. You see that CESifo has reacted immediately and brought this hand-powered air conditioning. And then there's always cold water in the lobby. Just serve yourself and have some when you want to. There will be a photographer taking a few pictures during the session. I hope that's okay. If you want to object, please do so now. And most importantly, there will be a group photo at 5:15 p.m., so don't run away. Before that, also very important, dinner. So dinner is in a restaurant in Venice. You find the address in the booklet, and I would like to remind you that the boat is leaving at 7:20, and it's good they are really on time here. So be there 5 minutes early. Okay. Then final point, you know that about session timing. Authors have 30 minutes. We have 15 minutes for each discussant, and then 30 minutes for general discussion, which I trust will be very lively. Okay, great. So we should move to the first session, and the first paper is about tariffs uncertainty and the exchange rate by Alfonso and Tommaso, who are both here today, and the paper will, if I understand correctly, be presented by Tommaso. It's yours.
Okay. All right. So thank you very much. It's a real pleasure to be back here. I used to spend my summer vacations in Venice when I was a kid, and so it's really a pleasure to come back here. Let me thank Şebnem for putting together this great program, for inviting us to write the paper, and thanks to the discussants in advance for all the comments that we got early on, that added also on Şebnem's comments, and that was really useful for us. So let me get into it. So since Liberation Day, I think we learned that tariffs, which for a long time were thought and treated as a limited phenomenon, or only a phenomenon for trade economists to analyze, all of a sudden became a substantial macroeconomic event. And so macroeconomists, including myself and Alfonso, started working on this. There are contributions in a recent literature, both empirically. People like Martin and Stephanie have contributed recently with important papers.
Recording in progress.
And there's also been a resurgence of interest in theoretical models that would analyze the macro and general equilibrium implications of tariffs, interacted in particular also with monetary policy, a sort of a new dimension that wasn't analyzed before. So this paper contributes to both the empirical debate on recent empirical debate on tariffs and on the macro theory debate. In particular, we're going to put some emphasis on something that we label as an exchange rate puzzle, a puzzle that emerges from our empirical analysis and that we'll try to rationalize in a model. All right, in a nutshell, let me give you the overview of the paper. So we first go empirical, and we propose a narrative dominance identification strategy to estimate and quantify the effects of tariff shocks on a number of variables, in particular on nominal and real exchange rates, and discuss a list of results, right, that I'm going to summarize very briefly. So, conditional on our identification strategy. So we find that overwhelmingly tariff shocks are contractionary, so they lead to contraction in GDP and investment. They have a mixed effect on inflation. So initially a deflationary effect, and then with inflation picking up in the medium run. So if you take these first two results, you can sort of frame the short run effects of tariff shocks, of increases in tariffs, as negative demand effect. Number three, we find surprisingly, given our expectations, that tariff shocks depreciate, and we are talking about US tariffs. Those are the measures that we're going to use. Depreciate the US dollar effective exchange rate, the nominal and real exchange rate, and that is a result very much against the conventional wisdom. The textbook analysis implies, we'll get to this, that increases in tariffs should lead to an appreciation of the exchange rate. We then find a mixed effect on the trade balance with an initial improvement and a deterioration. This also will be important. And we also find that the response of monetary policy is clearly expansionary, significantly expansionary, which again seems consistent with this negative aggregate demand effect that I illustrated at the beginning. We generally find, quantitatively, that tariff shocks explain a non-negligible share of the business cycle variance of some key variables. Okay, so they're not Mickey Mouse shocks. We find, as far as the exchange rate effect is concerned, we find it in the two major recent trade wars, the 1819 trade wars in the first Trump administration, especially against China, and the most recent one, that tariff shocks in both cases contribute to a depreciation of the exchange rate. Right? And again, also this conditional effect is somehow non-obvious. Finally, in the last section, we unpack these results, and we show that the effects of tariff shocks are actually that we identify in a Bayesian var unconditionally, actually are conditional on an important state variable, which is the the degree of trade policy uncertainty, or what we label as structural trade policy uncertainty. So the idea is, right, when firms observe an announcement, firms and households and agents observe an announcement of an increase in tariffs, firms and markets face this question, right? Is this a lasting change in the trade policy regime, or is it just a negotiation device? It's just noise, it is just an announcement, but without bringing a permanent or persistent change in the fundamental, in the structural trade policy regime of the country, right? So we propose a methodology to identify the persistent structural component of trade policy uncertainty. So we start so we extrapolate from a stochastic volatility model this component that we label as structural trade policy uncertainty, and we find, right, that this, for example, that this depreciation result of the exchange rate only holds conditional on high levels of trade policy, of structural trade policy uncertainty, whereas the textbook results on the exchange rate mostly arises in regimes of low structural trade policy uncertainty, as well as results on GDP, like an increase in GDP with low uncertainty and a decrease in GDP with high trade policy uncertainty. And then we build a model that I'll touch upon briefly to a new Keynesian model where we trace out the effects of the equilibrium effects of tariffs in the presence of tariff policy uncertainty. All right, so we study a Bayesian VAR in a sample going from 1990 until the second quarter of 25. We use 3 different measures of tariffs. Two of these measures have been taken and computed by Martin and Stephanie in a previous paper. Although our preferred measure will be this weighted import tariff index computed in also a recent paper by Franconi and Hack. Right? These are the 3 indices. You see that they are very highly correlated, and so results are very robust across these indices of tariffs. Okay, let me spend 2 minutes on identification. Okay, so we identifying the effects of tariff shocks is not easy. Definitely, you cannot it's not easy to apply, for example, now very fashionable high frequency identification methods with tariffs. Definitely, you don't want to go with zero restrictions in standard VARs like Cholesky identification. So here, Martin and Stephanie have a different approach. Here we have a very different approach from the recent literature. So we propose a narrative dominance identification approach that works in 4 steps. So the first step is to identify anchor dates. Okay, so in a narrative sense, we look at identified announcements of tariff policy changes that are clearly identified in the data. So these changes in tariff indices must be detectable according to an objective index, a z-score. So they must be sufficiently large, at least 1 standard deviation. And in a statistical sense, following the work of Antolin Diaz and Rubio Ramirez, right, we given all the episodes of tariff changes that are sufficiently large that we identify, right, we then ultimately identify a tariff shock as the largest positive contributor to the 1 step ahead forecast error of the tariff index, right? And 1, 2, 3 is a strategy that is sufficient to identify plausibly exogenous shocks to tariffs in the VAR. In order to make our identification even tighter, we also apply a single, relatively mild sign restriction. So we assume that tariff shocks reduce real imports, right? are shocks that are defined in that way, but only at horizons 1 and 2, not at horizon 0, not contemporaneously, in order to avoid well-known effects of front-loading, right? That we also observed with the last Trump administration decisions. Okay, so firms importing a lot of goods in anticipation of tariffs being implemented, let's say in the following period. All right, that's the identification. So we come up with two basic dates for identification. Remember this. Be reminded that in this methodology, you need 1, 2, very, very few dates to identify correctly your shock. And the first date is 2018 Q4, and that's an episode larger than 1 standard deviation of the increase in the tariff index. And this is an episode of increase in tariffs essentially on, which is large, $200 billion applied on China. Whereas the second date, of course, is the quarter 2 of 2025, which is Liberation Day. Then we have an extended number of dates, right? We prove robustness of our results, but the methodology, for the methodology, it's enough to use the first 2 dates, plus the sign restriction. Okay, these are our results, right? So, and 1 standard deviation increase in tariffs reduces the real GDP and investment. This is unambiguously contractionary. These are credible bands in the Bayesian sense. So you should mostly look at the blue and dark blue areas. The reduction in inflation is temporary, and then inflation picks up after 5 quarters. Right? You have this S-shaped effect on the trade balance. A clear increase in macroeconomic uncertainty. That's also an interesting result, and probably that is something that is behind the simultaneous contraction in inflation and GDP that we observe. And as you see, an increase in tariffs leads to a depreciation of the nominal exchange rate. Now, be mindful. So here, a fall in the exchange rate. To be sure, a fall in the exchange rate is a depreciation, right? So we checked this 200 times. Okay, and that holds also for the real effective exchange rate. So I'm not going to show you, right? So that's the puzzling result. Okay, this is very puzzling because the textbook would suggest that an increase in tariffs leads to a change in relative prices, either of currencies or of goods, right? You're going to import less of foreign goods, so you're going to demand less of foreign currency, relatively more of domestic currency, and this should lead per se, and ceteris paribus, to an appreciation of the exchange rate, but we actually find no trace in the data of any depreciation effect. Appreciation effect, sorry. So this is the historical variance decomposition of the real effective exchange rate. So in red we see, so we focus on the real exchange rate. In red we see the contribution of tariff shocks, right? So here let me isolate 2 episodes which are very important. The first and the second, the trade war, as I mentioned at the beginning. I see that in both cases, the contribution of tariff shocks is in the direction of depreciation. Okay, so that is something that is reassuring for us. Europe, we also looked at the effects on Europe very quickly, since we have to say something on the euro area. Right, so here even more clearly, tariff increases in the US lead to a negative aggregate demand effect on the euro area, so a contraction in GDP and a contraction in inflation, and an accommodation by monetary policy. So even more starkly here, if a foreign country like the US imposes tariffs, this plays out as in the short run at least, as a negative demand shock. All right. Now we want to think about, given these results and this battery of results, right? Now we're gonna think about the environment where tariffs are imposed, right? In which environment of trade policy, and specifically of trade policy uncertainty, tariffs are imposed. Right? We could think of a taxonomy of trade policy uncertainty. So we could think of transitory increases in tariffs that actually bring about only a transitory effect on uncertainty in the trade policy regime. For example, this could be uncertainty over, how high will tariffs be, right? Or noisy announcements like, Trump announcing 100% tariffs on China. Okay, so all this uncertainty, right, is in a way resolved at implementation. Okay, so Trump can go crazy announcing that the US are going to impose 100% tariffs on China, but then in the end, right, at implementation, things don't play out that way. So this is mostly a noisy component of uncertainty that we want to tease out, that we want to identify and wash out. Right? Whereas we are interested instead in isolating a structural component of trade policy uncertainty, meaning uncertainty over the persistence, right, of the trade policy regime, which of course changes the expectations about, about future tariffs. Right? For example, I don't know, the U.S. withdrawing from the TPP, right, is a manifestation of increased uncertainty on the trade policy regime. Okay, so we propose. I didn't do anything. Okay, so then we do a simple decomposition, right? So we assume that our tariff index, right, is made of two components, a structural and a transitory component, and then we estimate a stochastic volatility model, right? So we assume that both components have some persistence and they have variance, respectively sigma s and sigma t, right? That itself evolves in a persistent way. Of course, our prior in this Bayesian estimation is that the S component is way more persistent than the transitory component. And so we estimate this model with Bayesian methods applying this particle filter methodology, right? So we extract exactly this measure, sigma S, right? Which is what we, from the data, from this objective methodology, statistical methodology, what we label as structural trade policy uncertainty, right? So for us, STPU is the estimated variance of the structural component of the tariff index. Okay, and so here is our estimate of sigma. Okay, so of structural trade policy uncertainty in red. Okay, and this is compared with the well-known TPU index, trade policy uncertainty index, computed by in well-known work by Caldara and Iacoviello. And let me emphasize that these two indices are completely different, right? So our measure is a measure that comes from the estimation of the structural component that I showed you before. The TPU index of Caldara and Iacoviello is a narrative index based on newspaper wording of trade policy uncertainty, right? So it's sort of a perception-based, subjective measure of trade policy uncertainty, which in fact spikes up like crazy. This is the blue line with Liberation Day. Okay. We find a very different result once we apply our very different methodology, right? What we label as structural trade policy uncertainty as an important increase during the first trade war, but in 2025, the structural component of uncertainty for us increases much less than the overall index of trade policy uncertainty. Which is again newspaper based, and in our view picking up a lot of noise, right, and a lot of noise related to announcements. Okay, so then we run we extract our tariff shocks from the Bayesian VAR, Okay, and now then we run under some conditions a set of local projections that are conditioned on our STPU indicator. Okay, so now we want to measure whether the identified tariff shock, okay, produces an effect on a variable of interest, inflation, exchange rate, you name it, under different regimes of structural trade policy uncertainty, with the regimes being defined by a dummy that takes a value of 1 when our measure of a structural trade policy uncertainty is in the top 30th decile. We do robustness on the different deciles. Okay, and here are the results. Okay, again, these are estimated impulse responses to the identified tariff shocks in the primitive Bayesian VAR, but these impulse responses are now computed using the local projections, right? And the red case is the case of high structural trade policy uncertainty when our estimated STPU index is in the high range of realizations, whereas the blue case is the case when this index of structural trade policy uncertainty is sufficiently low, right? And we see, right, that this exchange rate result varies dramatically across the two regimes. When structural trade policy uncertainty is low, we recover the textbook result of an appreciation, make sure, of the exchange rate, holds also for the real exchange rate, but our more surprising result of real or nominal depreciation holds in the case of a high structural trade policy uncertainty regime. But also other responses are, this is the real effective exchange, but other responses vary across STPU regimes. So the contraction in GDP is mostly a story of the high uncertainty regime, right? Whereas the effect on GDP of increases in tariffs is mildly expansionary when uncertainty is low. Uncertainty, not macro uncertainty, trade policy uncertainty. And the effect on the trade balance itself varies. We get an improvement of the trade balance under high uncertainty and a deterioration under low uncertainty. And also monetary policy responds in a way more accommodative way under the regime of high STP. Okay, so we became particularly interested in the exchange rate result, right? And now if I have, how much, 3 minutes? 6 minutes, okay? I'm gonna walk you through a model, okay, which I'm going to present in just 2 equations to give you a sense of how you can rationalize an exchange rate depreciation as a function, in an equilibrium model, as a function of the underlying degree of trade policy uncertainty. Okay, but these are our main results. All right. So think of the following environment. Think of the following environment in which you have originally a purely transitory tariff shock, but firms and households behave in an environment of uncertainty. So they observed an increase in tariffs, but the increase in tariffs is just a noisy signal, okay, made of 2 components: a purely transitory component and a more persistent component. Okay, so the idea in a nutshell is that in a regime of let's say complete information to build the limit case or low trade policy uncertainty, let's say complete information, if the shock in tariffs is purely transitory, it is recognized as transitory. So this is going to lead to a classic and textbook expenditure switching on currencies and goods and an appreciation of the exchange. But in the case in which, at least partially, the purely transitory shock is read and misinterpreted in this signal extraction type of problem misread as partly persistent, and how much persistent you're going to misinterpret the shock is going to depend on the degree of trade policy uncertainty. And so if you at least partially misinterpret the transitory shock as persistent, I'm going to show you in a second, you're going to borrow against future surpluses, right? So you're going to anticipate that the tariff shock will be at least partially persistent, so that is going to lead to future increases in trade balances. And so today you're going to borrow against these future increases in trade balance surpluses, and so this is going to lead to a currency depreciation. So this is a story that can be told just in one equation. Okay, and this is going to be the last slide, right? So the first equation is in linear terms, log linear terms, is up to some point a standard UIP condition, right? But augmented under incomplete markets with a component BT, which is the component of net foreign assets accumulated at time t. Okay, so to be clear, I'm not appending a financial premium in net foreign assets to a standard UIP condition. This kind of UIP condition, as an equilibrium condition or arbitrage condition, with the financial premium included, can be derived in a very general class of models with incomplete markets. Okay, so starting with simple models with portfolio adjustment cost in foreign assets, popularized also again by the work of Martin and Stefani and others. Two more recent models with international financial segmentation, a la Jácome and Muken, or Gabex and Maggiori, and so on. Right? So this is very general. All right. Okay, so now equation number 2, right? Through the intertemporal budget constraint, of course, the current level of net foreign asset is inversely related to the present discounted value of future trade balances. All right. So if this present value is positive, so you expect future trade balances to be in surplus and positive in the future, there is a minus in front. You're going to reduce net foreign asset today, so you're going to borrow against that. Those expected future trade balances, right? So you can rewrite the UIP condition in present value form as a function of a standard real interest rate differential and the present discounted value of expected future trade balances. Okay, so from here you can get all the intuition of the model, right? In an environment of uncertainty, of trade policy uncertainty, to the extent that even purely primitive tariff shocks are transitory, but are partially misinterpreted as persistent, right? And in that environment of uncertainty, agents are going to expect future trade balance surpluses, right? And so they are going to borrow against those expected future trade balance surpluses. So BT is going to fall. The real exchange rate is going to depreciate. Don't be puzzled. In the model, a rise in the real exchange rate is a depreciation. Okay, so I'm sorry if this is a bit confusing between the VAR and the model. In the model, a depreciation is a rise in the real exchange. Right. So you borrow today, BT falls, the real exchange rate depreciate. Right, and notice that this effect that comes from expectations of future trade balance surpluses would not be there under certainty, right? Because here we are going to look at the effects of purely IID tariff shocks, right? That morph endogenously into persistent shocks precisely because of the underlying degree of trade policy uncertainty. All right, so that's the bulk of the model. So now here I'm going to conclude. Right, so we're going to introduce a tariff in a standard New Keynesian model and decompose the tariffs into a permanent or structural persistent component and a noisy component, and so we're gonna derive our version of the UIP condition under uncertainty. Okay, so in the presence of purely transitory shocks, right? So the financial premium is not there because these are purely transitory shocks. But even if shocks are purely transitory, right? You have this persistence effect, right? The scales with the degree of trade policy uncertainty that is going to contribute, if this is positive, right, to a rise in the real exchange rate, so to a depreciation. Okay, so the contribution here is to build a model where one can analyze the effects of tariffs in an environment of uncertainty about the underlying trade policy regime, and this environment of uncertainty endogenously morphs originally transitory tariff shocks into partially persistent, right? Depending exactly on the degree of structural trade policy uncertainty, right? Which is our estimated measure from the VAR. Right? The larger is this, the larger is this Kalman gain, the larger is this estimated persistence effect, the larger is the depreciation effect coming from uncertainty of a given IID tariff shock. All right, so that's our that's the end of the presentation. So that shows you how the model behaves. Right, you do see that the model delivers this stark result. Right, that so now I'm presenting again the real exchange rate as in the VAR. Sorry, this was a bit confusing. Right, so here you see that the response of the real exchange rate varies dramatically under complete information, the blue case, relative to the case of uncertainty, high or mid. Okay, so you go from a standard appreciation, so here it's clarified to make it consistent with the VAR. Okay, we flipped the sign of the model, so this is consistent with the VAR. A rise in the real exchange rate is an appreciation. Okay, whereas the sign of the response flips in the case of high trade policy uncertainty, precisely due to this net foreign asset effect. Right, under certainty, there is no decumulation on net foreign assets, no borrowing against expected future surpluses, because the tariff shock is completely temporary. Right, it's only under uncertainty, right, that you're going to misinterpret part of the shock as persistent. You're going to borrow against expected future trade surpluses, and this is going to contribute to the depreciation of the real exchange. All right, that's the end of the presentation. So we revisited, or we think we are contributing to a small but rising important literature on the macro effects of tariff shocks, both empirical and theoretical. So we find this surprising result that post 1990, and we maybe can talk in the discussion about this, tariff shocks actually lead to a depreciation of the US dollar, nominal and real, overturning the textbook result. And we specifically highlight that the macro results, including the exchange rate result, are especially conditional on the underlying uncertainty about the trade policy regime. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you, Tommaso. And the first discussant is Muhammed.
First, thanks for the organizers for including us and including me as a discussant of this paper. I learned a great deal from Tommaso and Alfonso, and like they did a great job. Like we submitted our comments and they returned back with almost complete our whole paper. So I really appreciate taking them into account.
Thank you.
So what's Tommaso already went over this, but I want to come to the puzzle and then the contribution one by one. So one is the textbook logic is that the unilateral tariffs give rise to...
Yeah, we are live streaming, so everybody needs to speak to the microphone.
Okay.
Another microphone.
Is one microphone up? Is one of these?
No, it's at the same time.
Okay. So in the textbook case, we have the unilateral tariffs, which gives rise to appreciation. But April 2025, especially the Liberation Day tariffs, we saw that the dollar depreciated greatly. And the author's answer is about the perception or the persistence of uncertainty that flips the sign related to related to the exchange rate. And this is, they claim that this is state dependent and not universal. So the contribution, first, they do an agnostic identification of the tariff shocks. So FX sign, they don't impose anything. And they ask the right question. They start with the durable regime, not new salience. And then they talk about, they relate this to the first moment belief of Channel, about the misperception in the transitory or the stability of the tariffs, and which leads to net foreign assets depreciation and the not risk premium. And they have this one state variable that's called the structural tariff policy uncertainty that unifies the tariffs. So I have like one major comment about this to start with. So the three headline 2025 features rest on a sample ending at the shock. So I think like in the empirical side, that might be something to be improved on. And I'm going to come to that in a bit. So to go to their contribution a little bit more detailed, they do this Bayesian VAR, and they basically identify based on the narrative dominance in 2018 Q4 and 2025 Q2. So, and what the authors do is, again, like a couple of things. They only restrict the imports in the H1 and H2 periods to be negatively signed, and they leave the FX sign free. But FX is the only asset price in the system. And the other thing is in the 2025 Q2, there's such a huge shock in 10.6. Almost all the narrative dominance might be lost there. So identification mostly rests on the 2018 Q4. So that's will be, I think I'll come to this point as well in a bit. The second thing is they have this STPU that they estimate. And here they have the persistent and the transitory regime. And this STPU captures the volatility of the persistent innovations, not the level. So that's what the difference between the right-hand side and the left-hand side. In the left-hand side, we see that STPU goes down, even though the tariff levels are still up. So basically, it's about the people's perceptions about the future tariffs. So that was an important aha moment for me to understand the paper in a little bit more detail. And then they do the local projections. And one thing that I would highlight here again, for H greater than 0, we lose the 2025 Q2 observation because of the sample limitations. And also like that, in the 2018-2020 period, if you look at what's happening, there is appreciation of the exchange rate. So that kind of, I know like the model includes all these different aspects, but that's something that I'll come in a bit as well. And the model, Tommaso did a brilliant job explaining the model. So a high STPU, they do people mistreat the transitory as durable, they borrow, net foreign assets go down, and depreciation now, and this STPU creates this flip. Okay, so my first comment will be about this weight on the terminal observation. It says 2025 Q2, it's a really big shock, and 2018 Q4 is like ideal size for Bayesian VAR, I would say. So there are three issues, like there is no post-shock data. Impulse response is extrapolated. And the 10 standard deviation, it gives you high leverage on the leg structure and residual covariance, because once you apply this shock, and then many other things co-move, and then you, in the covariance structure, you might be misattributing some of the stuff to the tariffs, and dominance near binding. So I think there are two things that could follow up. Like one is to do until 2024 Q4 and check out of samples for 25, or extend the data, right? The second comment is like to understand how much is the tariff effect, because especially in recent months, around the Liberation Day, we already saw a big increase in the exchange rate, and then depreciation started before the Liberation Day. So, like again, this ending the sample in 2024 Q4 could be something that could be done. And I'm going to skip this. And third point that I want to raise is what's bundled in, because as I mentioned when I talked about BVAR, the exchange rate was the only asset price in the system. So if there's something else happening in the system that gives rise to exchange rate movements, especially in the last period or the periods before, then we wouldn't be able to disentangle them, right? And so, like, would it be good to have some additional prices, like 10-year bond price equities, or some treasury basis to disentangle this portion? And something related to that, it was puzzling for me, especially when I look at this, the composition of the real exchange rate. So I agree with this part, but like this one was puzzling for me, especially around 2010, because like we see a blip in the WIT1 compared to WIT2, WIT1 compared to WIT2. And the reason is WIT1 is consumption-weighted tariff rate. So it's about like, if my consumption basket changes, my WIT1 changes. But WIT2 or TRI, they are more focused on the tariff rate other than that. So because of this increase, I think the system identifies the increase in the tariff part, and this attribution around this part, I think it's again some type of other macro effects being convoluted in the response. So that's one thing that I realized from this figure. And another point that I want to raise is again going back to this the last point of the sample. So of course, last point of the sample being 2025 Q2, which we had a huge, which we had a huge increase in the tariff rate, right? Because of the system, how it's estimated. Initially, when you have this big spike, the system will attribute very small part to the structural part, and it will assume it's transitioning. But if we extend the sample, then the transitory part of the SCPU for 2025 will become more of the structural parts, right? So again, like ending the system in this high note, it creates this bias of having a CPU measure being super low at the end. So, but it's a very tiny contribution, but we needed a little bit more data to extend the analysis, right? And it also goes back to this SCPU, like what type of tariff regime you're in, right? We were in the rule-based regime before. We had GATT, WTO, free trade agreements, rule-based, and then we have the tariff regime that somebody says my favorite word in English is tariffs, right? So like we go from one to another, but historically, like tariffs have been super sticky, super stable. Like once the tariff is there, like the chicken tax, we talk about it, it was something that was done in 1960s on American trucks because of Europe imposed tariffs on chickens. And at the end of the day, still we have that thing lying around, right? So that's why, but still, when we have by whim, Trump introduces tariffs, they become super sticky. I agree, like there are some examples like 100% to China, but other than that, almost all the Liberation Day tariffs, they became sticky, and we are now in 17 to 20% tariff rate, those type of stuff, right? So that part relates to this calibration part about the transitory part of the tariff. What do we see? How does the transitory part change over time? Seeing those could be cool. And model is rich. And I really like the model, like doing a simple extension, getting this term into the the belief about the future tariffs giving rise to the real exchange rate discount. But I would also maybe push a little bit, if I may, looking at the other moments, like the GDP, inflation, Fed cuts, like those type of stuff. And one other thing is the threshold mechanics. So I'm not going to go into the detail, but if I plug the numbers in, this K star becomes super large, like it becomes a very high number. I think in your IRFs about the model, even the medium-sized TPU was giving rise to many of the results. I think it's because of this high level, like the K star being so high, it makes the tariff barrier very low. So you see most of the results because of that. So the calibration about like the state space, it could be interesting to see as well. So, so this paper, basically it's about relearning the persistent stance of tariffs, the first movement. The sigma S is frozen. So we have, with Şebnem, we have another paper. We talk about the variance directly affecting the people's choices, consumption decisions. So it's a super complementary, and like the authors make a nice point about that in the paper. And so I would like to show how we do it in 1 second. So in our case, basically this tariffs variance comes into the Euler equation and also into the UIP condition, and the rest is standard. We don't do small open economy, so there's also some changes of the dynamics because of this. We have two symmetric countries in our simple model, but at the end of the day, we arrive at a similar equation in the sense that there is a positive, like there is a depreciationary part and appreciationary part that gives rise to the sign flip, but it's a complementary approach. But what I would ask maybe to complement this, if I may again, from the authors, is to come up with a little bit more dynamic version of the estimation of STPU, because in the model, the sigma S term is constant, assumed to be constant, and you are relearning it. And if there are some regime changes, maybe that could be it. Okay, so I think like my major comments are, we need to reestimate like this, having the 2025 tariff at the end by itself. It might be a little like making the robustness of the results a little bit shaky. And I want to congratulate the authors for this nice paper with these 4 different steps, and looking forward to the next version. Thank you.
Thank you, Muhammed. And the second discussant is Basile.
So thank you very much to Şebnem to organize this great conferences. I mean, it's always a pleasure to be in Venice. You know, whenever I look at the window and I see a bunch of boats, I'm always happy. So, and so this is like also a great pleasure, but quite difficult to discuss one of Tommaso and Alfonso paper, because they are really master of their craft. And so, you know, what do you say to a master? That's kind of that's going to be the lingering thing of my discussion. So I guess the kind of motivation for that paper, and I guess for all the discussion around tariff, is kind of symbolized with those kind of headlines. You know, one day one crazy guy comes up, impose a bunch of tariff with no basis whatsoever. Then, you know, a few days later, he kind of, you know, put a pause on that. And then it turns out that, you know, there is the rule of law in that country, and so turns out it's not even allowed to do that. And then, you know, all of that is very kind of erratic and uncertain. I mean, God knows what is in his mind, and God knows what's the next move, right? So that's kind of what's the question that Tommaso and Alfonso try to answer. What is the macroeconomic effect of tariff policy, and especially of erratic tariff policy like we see? And so what they show in their paper is that uncertainty about the tariff policy do matter, not just the level, right? They do those three things. First, this narrative BVAR estimation of tariff shocks unconditionally. Then they look at conditional on this structural tariff policy uncertainty. And then, they bring a model with incomplete international financial market to kind of rationalize and put a little bit of structure. I mean, the model was very helpful to me to read this thing. And so I have to say, once more, I'm very impressed by those type of paper because personally, I'm always very confused with this appreciation, depreciation, change from slide to slide. So, when I have to teach that every year to my undergraduate first-year student, I'm glad the first-year student and they don't know anything. So then they can, get away with anything. So that's very humbling for me to discuss this paper. So let me try to kind of summarize briefly, but I think, Tommaso did a great job of explaining the discussion. Your summary was much better than mine, so I'm going to be kind of fast, right? Okay. So here is like one slide trying to summarize the empirical result. So focus on the last column. You have kind of this unconditional estimate that is based on this narrative dominance BVAR, and then essentially that's kind of puzzling because this is kind of not what the textbook will tell you. And as soon as you split that between low and high structural trade policy uncertainty, then the low structural trade policy uncertainty goes back to our textbook, so that's kind of fine. But then the high structural uncertainty is giving kind of what you find in the unconditional. So in a sense, the unconditional result is kind of led by the structural thing. So if your textbook model doesn't work, there is only one way to beat a model is to bring a new model. And so that's what Tommaso and Alfonso do. So what's the model? Small open economy, flexible price, but with PPI targeting, no capital whatsoever, but incomplete market. And that's going to be the key. Because those incomplete market, the micro foundation in the paper, but as Tommaso explained, they can be many, is some sort of portfolio adjustment cost in your foreign asset position. The model kind of boils down to, I guess you need two equations to understand. I need a third one maybe. Just the first one that kind of, tell me where tariff shows up. Here, tariff, the first equation is the CPI, the price of the price indices of the consumption good, which is a function of the price of the domestic goods and the price of the foreign goods, right? So that's tariff will enter directly in this equation. Thanks to this incomplete market assumption, the traditional uncover interest parity condition is a bit modified by this blue term that now make the net foreign asset position enter into the pricing of this real exchange rate. And then, this intertemporal, the budget constraint is telling us that the net foreign asset position is just, you borrow today against expect your future surplus. So that's kind of, the three equations of the model. Then you have this other layer that kind of had this uncertainty or kind of, this is, I'm guessing, what people do whenever you hear any comment of Trump, right? It's like, one day they sign a deal in Scotland, and a few weeks later the deal is, we don't know if the deal is still in and out. I'm guessing the MPs of the European Parliament that have to approve this deal, they still wonder what are they voting on. So that's kind of, they face with this. They face that, they observe the TOT, which is the tariff, and then they don't know if, is it transitory, crazy comment by a crazy policymaker, or is it persistent kind of, real swing in trade policy. And so the difference between the persistence and the transitory is that if you have a shock to the persistent part of the trade policy, that's going to shift the entire expected path, not just kind of today's shock. So here, agents are kind of Bayesian. They know that there is kind of uncertainty. They know that there is a persistent and transitory, and then so they kind of do a Kalman filter where K will be the Kalman filter gain. Then they put some kind of weight whenever they see kind of a tariff surprise. They put some weight to the persistent part, and then the remainder they interpret it as transitory. So if you have a pure transitory shock, Trump waking up one day and then decided that French wine is not good anymore for him, so he's willing to put a high tariff on it. You don't know. You put some weight to that being kind of a permanent swing of U.S. trade policy, and then some weight thinking that this is kind of transitory. But because you kind of perceive this path to be persistent, then your whole expectation about the future tariff will be kind of contaminated by this kind of one shock transitory thing. And so that together with the fact that the exchange rate is like pricing the expected future trade balance give you kind of those results. In the paper, I encourage you to read it because there is a lot of like derivation of, in close form of what is the effect of each shock and so on. I'm just going to go with the kind of numerical result, and that's exactly, you can essentially rationalize what they found in the data, right? As soon as you have, if you're under complete information, we kind of had a clear idea of what was the trade policy in the US, there will be the real exchange rate will appreciate and will increase under complete information. And as soon as you have incomplete information, if you have relatively high structural trade policy uncertainty, then you have kind of this depreciation, right? Which percolate into the output, into the inflation dynamic, into the monetary policy response, and into the consumption. Right? So once more on that thing, I don't have much to say. I'm still confused with appreciation, depreciation. So the only thing I can try to, and then those guys, they master of their craft. So there is nobody to give advice to a maestro. What you want to do is kind of bring what you know. So I'm going to try to kind of bring what my literature says, or at least what they can try to answer to kind of this question, which is the long run effect of tariff. So, we personally consider that trade policy might be a bit erratic, and so, but still, you might want to kind of try to think or try to put yourself in the head of Donald Trump. I don't recommend it, but if you do, maybe like try to kind of listen to what he has in mind. Why does he think tariff is a good thing? And I think that's kind of percolate into a bunch of quotes at different periods that he did. Which is, right on the Liberation Day speech, it's all about we're going to put tariff and that's going to bring back job and factory to the US, right? This is all about, and even if you like kind of focus on some industry, this was like after kind of talking about automobile industry increase in tariff, same thing. It's like we're going to bring construction, we're going to construct a lot of plants, we're going to produce American car in the US, that's going to bring back factories, jobs. And even when they talk to their best partner, the Canadian Prime Minister, we don't want, he said, we don't want like whatever your steel and your aluminium because we want to produce it here, right? Okay, so now let me try to at least explain how I understand the statement. I understand the statement about something about capital accumulation, right? Because factory is essentially a bunch of capital. And, despite Tommaso and Alfonso model being very, very interesting and illuminating, there is one thing that is missing, also because they focus kind of on the short run, is that there is no capital, and there is essentially no capital accumulation. There is a very good reason not to think about capital accumulation because, solving a dynamic trade model with a bunch of capital, you might want a capital stock for each sector in each country. That's a lot of state variable. That's like very complicated. But fortunately, there is a bunch of people that have tried to kind of do that. And so I'm going to advertise not my paper, which usually you do in a discussion. I'm going to advertise someone else's paper. So that's David Baki and Malberg 2026 paper, which is called Long-Run Comparative Statics. So in a nutshell, this is the slide to explain kind of the general idea. And then they have one application on trade tariffs. So I'm going to first kind of explain the general idea and then try to see how they apply it. So the idea is that if you take kind of a dynamic, complicated model, as complicated as you want, but that has some sort of balanced growth path or a steady state, then what they show is that this balanced growth path is equivalent in the sense that long-run price and quantity would be identical in those two models, which is equivalent to a static economy with a bunch of wedges. Capital accumulation by construction is kind of introducing a wedges on the price of capital. And so why this is so cool? Because David and actually Emmanuel Fari have built a whole toolbox to analyze the effect of change in parameter, of change in shock in static economies. So once you kind of, use that equivalence, you can apply all the tools that David and Emmanuel told us, the Hulton theorem result, the extension by David and Emmanuel to kind of study, essentially being able to approximate the effect of a shock without even needing to solve the model, just a bunch of kind of parameters. So you can always use all this kind of static tools to apply it to this static economy, which is equivalent to your big complicated dynamic model. And then you can essentially do comparative static of your balanced gross path without even the need to solve your model. And so what David and Malberg does is that they kind of, use that toolbox. They apply it to a few things. They apply it to like sanction against Russia, but they also apply it in one short paper on tariff, right? So what they do is that they build this, kind of complicated, quantitatively relevant model with like multi-country, multi-industry dynamic, dynamic trade model, some OLG structure to kind of have an elastic demand for capital, a bunch of incomplete markets. Also, they have kind of the whole production network of international production network in the world, across the whole world economy, but also they have an investment network, which means that to produce an investment good, you need to, combine a bunch of other goods. And that's going to be important because, each sector country, they will have their own capital. So think of it, I think they have like 9 countries or 9 regions. They probably have like 20 around industry. So that's 9 times 20 state variable to handle, right? And so the idea here is that, let's use their toolbox. They take this kind of complicated model, they kind of, give the equation of the balanced gross path. They apply they compute the equivalent static economy. They apply their toolbox on the static economy, and then they can, tell you something about what is the effect of trade in the balanced gross path of that model. So that would be the long-term effect in a model like this. And here the mechanism is kind of cool, which is that investment goods turns out to be kind of import-intensive good. To produce the average investment good in the US, you need to import stuff from Europe, from China, from everywhere. And so when you put tariff, you're going to essentially increase the relative price of capital versus the price of labor. That's going to decrease the capital demand. And then essentially your balanced gross path long-run stock of capital is going to be lower. Lower capital in the balanced gross path, lower consumption, lower real wage. So that's kind of the effect that they have. Which is interesting here is that because the long-run stock of capital is low, and that's consistent with what Tommaso and Alfonso found, that like investment kind of goes down, it's going to actually amplify the shock, because the short-run effect is actually going to be smaller than the eventual long-term effect. So then what they do is that they calibrate this model using a bunch of data, and then they look at a case where US enter into a tariff war with the rest of the world. They're going to apply this I don't like to call it liberation day, these crazy day things, where they're going to look at the unilateral trade reduction by the US versus the symmetric retaliation. Everyone's kind of imposing the same thing. And then they're going to use their tools, and that's what they find. So let's focus on the unilateral case, because that's kind of seems to be surprisingly the equilibrium. And then let's focus on the third column, which is the one with capital adjustment, and compare it to the, where capital is fixed. So capital is fixed is that you don't allow any change in the capital stock. All right? So you kind of go back to your static kind of trade model. Unilateral tariff increase leads to kind of a positive gain in consumption. This is only consumption number compared to the free trade version. But as soon as you allow capital to adjust, this kind of small gain are gone. The cost of those policy is, multiplied by a factor of 5 or 4, right? So as soon as you kind of take into account, at least that's their conclusion, as soon as you take into account capital accumulation, capital allocation, kind of the idea that Trump has in mind, okay, we want to bring back factoring, turns out you actually, obviously that it's wrong in his mind, you actually get big kind of loss. And then as soon as you have retaliation on top, then, the loss from the trade war in the long run, right? This is kind of forever lower consumption. And then if you think about real wage, this is kind of actually even a stronger effect. Right? So to conclude, this is a very interesting paper, highly relevant subject. the empirical results are surprising, and then it's rationalized by a simple but illuminating model, and that's kind of that's all you want. I'm not surprised that Tommaso and Alfonso deliver that. That's kind of not their first goal, kind of. But it's true that because we were kind of lacking a bunch of tools, studying the long-run effect of those trade policy, especially taking into account this capital accumulation, might actually kind of be important. It's complicated, but the good thing is, a bunch of people have new tools to develop that. That's it for me.
Thank you, Basile.
Shall I answer now or take questions?
I would suggest you may react now. You may react to discussions now, and then we take questions, right?
All right. Okay. So, and then maybe Alfonso, if you want to add something. Okay. So, I mean, thanks both. I think that you guys must have sort of talked ex ante, because it was nice that you, Basile, focused more on the sort of theory side and Muhammed on the empirical side, and so this was great for us. Thank you. These were great comments. So the first comment is on the role for identification, the possibly disproportionate role that that quarter 225 might play for identification, okay? Because I mean, we have to live with that. That the Liberation Day tariff date is or quarter is a huge increase in tariffs, and so that has pros and cons in the sense that it helps a lot for identification, and even if that date is disproportionately contributing to identification, for the methodology, that's fine. Okay, so this is not my methodology, this is Rubio Ramirez and Antolin Diaz, but if we take even one date, of course, this gives us some problem for estimation. Okay, and it's correct what Muhammed is saying, that that date precisely also is the date where the sample ends, and so we take openly the suggestion of stopping the sample before and doing out of sample, and so this is correct and very useful. But again, for those who are not familiar with the methodology, again, it takes one date. Fortunately, this is the beauty of this methodology, provided that you can provide enough narrative evidence on the change in the instrument that you want to, whose shocks you want to identify. But let me also add that in our approach, we identify up to 4 dates that meet our criteria, and so we can rotate these dates, and we did, for robustness and at least for what we understood so far, results are not conditional on including or not including Liberation Day, Liberation Quarter as a date. So Muhammed also had some comments on the model. So first, he mentioned the fact that tariffs are very sticky. That's right. But regardless of whether the level of tariffs is sticky or not, what we want to emphasize here is that what matters is uncertainty. Okay, it's not. So it's really what agents perceive, what agents misunderstand possibly of the underlying trade policy regime that is important. And I think that especially for the the kind of especially for the recent periods and the recent part of the sample, right? When so take Trump 1 and Trump 2, right? We moved from a world where basically tariffs were low and stable, undetectable in a macro sense, if you want, or even undetectable in the policy discussion. And all of a sudden, you have the first trade war, you have the second trade war, and that generates a lot of uncertainty on the persistence of the underlying trade policy regime, precisely because we moved from an era of globalization with low tariffs and free trade to an era of larger uncertainty on the trade policy front. So thanks, Basile, you in pointing out and possibly a research agenda on the long-run effects of tariffs in general equilibrium. So the only answer we can give to your correct pointing out that according to quantitative models like Bocconi and co-authors, tariffs have this possibly long-run effect on capital accumulation. And so I don't want to claim that our results from the VAR are speaking to that, because they cannot per se. You cannot extrapolate from the identified shocks in that methodology long-run effects of tariffs, but still it is consistent. What you are pointing out is consistent with the evidence that we find that physical investment falls, and so that contributes to lower capital in the long run. But despite this, so having said this, this makes me think that there is a paper to be written on the empirical front, right? It makes me think of this Paulo Surico's paper on the long-run effect of fiscal policy and government spending, right? And applying that methodology and thinking about the long-run effect of tariffs might be actually a very good idea. Thank you. Alfonso, do you want to add something?
No.
Okay, so then we can take questions.
Okay, questions or comments, please.
Can you please put your...
Okay. I'm Latin American, so whenever I see a depreciation and lots of uncertainty going up, I think capital account. I never think real side. And when I think capital account, I think financial markets. And when I think about financial markets, I don't think in terms of substitution, stuff like that. I think balance sheets, other kind of factors. So to be honest, I'm skeptical. But having said that, I think that what is interesting of your measure is that it seems that the bulk of the explanatory power comes from the Trump 1, not Trump 2. And I think of actually most of the uncertainty about all these other things, Mar-a-Lago, Accord and things like that, are really much more of a Trump 2 than a Trump 1 phenomenon. Yeah. So it may well be the case that you prove me very wrong and you change my Latin American priors, because looks different. You have created an instrument that captures something that sounds like the generic volatility, but that it loads on a different period from the one in which we think those traditional sort of financial factors play a big role.
Do you want to respond directly, or we collect a few questions?
No, I think so. I'm sympathetic to what you're saying. Number one, in the model, because I think you have in mind the data, and but in the model, financial factors do play out. Actually, if you take a model like with segmented financial markets, limited risk-bearing capacity of financial intermediaries as Fanelli and Straub, Gabex and Maggiori, you get exactly the same effect. So in a way, we can reconcile it. So our measure of structural trade policy uncertainty, if I understand your comment well, looks at what you have in mind. So wants to capture what you have in mind, meaning all the blah 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 and Mar-a-Lago and noisy announcements threatening here and there. We treat it as noise, right? We try to tease out that component from a measure of trade policy regime uncertainty. This is what we're trying to do, and for that reason, our measure of uncertainty, of trade policy uncertainty, loads up a lot under Trump 1. Okay, so under Trump 1, things were done, Trump 1 or partially also Biden. So that was perceived as a structural change, if you want, in the underlying trade policy regime, according to our measure. So, besides the very detail of our measurement, I think the two trade wars don't have much in common. Okay, in terms of the type of policy uncertainty that they generated, but we can talk more about.
Can
this.
I say one thing? So
maybe I misunderstood. Maybe I misunderstood.
No. You understand. But what I'm saying is that maybe you can do more. Not treat it as noise. Just have you could put the traditional financial variable
okay.
on the right hand side, and since you're loading on such a different periods, it's very likely that you're going to come up with.
No, okay, this is also goes back to Muhammad's point that we only have one asset price in the VAR and we should may look at more. Absolutely. Okay.
Dimitri?
So I have one comment and one question. So the comment is that I think it's very illuminating and it's a very useful paper, right? So we saw after April 2025 several papers talking about depreciation of the dollar, trying to explain that. And then suddenly, you start talking to people and everyone starts asking, but actually, do we know that in normal times tariffs generate appreciation, right? And it turns out that the empirical literature is extremely thin, right? There is now a paper by Stephanie and Martin, there are work by Giancarlo Garcetti and co-authors, but I don't think actually we know it so well, right? We know that it is a robust prediction of the models, but the empirical work is surprisingly limited. So I think in that sense, providing identification, new ways to identify the shocks is very useful. So related to that, my question is about exactly like comparing that to the results of Giancarlo Garcetti. So I understand that persistence of the shock, this is one of the key uncertain variables here, but another one is retaliation, right? How much other countries would retaliate. And again, I'm not sure I subscribe to that view, but some people would argue that the reason dollar depreciated is because markets anticipated that in the long run, other countries would respond and also impose tariffs, right? And US is small relative to the rest of the world. So in the end, this retaliation will kind of dominate, right? And so I kind of wonder whether you can say something about that, whether your identification can already say or maybe adjust it to think about these things.
So should I? Okay. All right. So you're right that this. So the textbook idea that higher tariffs lead to appreciation is a textbook, right? And so and you can. I mean, I can say that even so. It depends on which textbook, because if you take if you tackle this question through the lens of say modern, let's say, as we say these days, modern Keynesian model, whatever, with all the equilibrium bells and whistles, you can, and where the response of tariffs inherently depends on the behavior of monetary policy, you can come up with appreciation, depreciation. So I'm not in a model, so I don't know what is the textbook, but what I know, at least I have begun to know, or we have begun to know, is that in the data, at least, we don't find any trace of appreciation, right? At least from our results, and so that is so it's fairly easy to build models that can be consistent with the depreciation result. I mean, our model is, as Mohamed was saying, is very complementary to the Şebnem and Muhammed's model and the result that came earlier than us. We have to know more from the empirics, right? So retaliation again, I know how it plays out in a model and what results you can take. I don't know exactly on the top of my head how we can control for that effect in our empirical analysis, but that's something, because it's not obvious. Something is captured by our measure of uncertainty in trade policy regime, right? But yes, maybe we can simply plain value insert some measure of EU tariffs or other countries' tariffs, but the problem is that you have to control for this anticipation effect. So it's not obvious, but it's obviously an important point empirically to control for. Yeah.
Okay, great. Antonio?
Antonio has 3 questions.
So, Antonio, one.
First question about import of GDP in United States virtually didn't change in the last 10 years. It was 14.6 in 2016 before Trump, and it's 14.3 now. So this begs the question of all the mechanisms that, and this despite actually nature-given shock like COVID, Trump-given shock like tariffs. And so this, I think that we need to explain this incredible resilience. And your model, I'm not sure that does this because actually it plays a lot with intertemporal substitution, which doesn't seem to be in the data, despite all the shock, anticipated, not anticipated, and it's so stubborn there, 14.5 always. Second, it's a clarification, given this premise. How do you aggregate across different tariffs? Across different states, because I think that the big surprise was how heterogeneous cross-sectionally was the tariff patterns. And this comes probably the elasticity of substitution across import from different countries is much higher than we thought, which would explain the first result, the visually constants of the import share. And third, it's a little bit related, it's about how do you deal, I still don't understand how do you deal with anticipation and endogeneity, in the sense that Trump, at least not COVID, says that the shocks are not really exogenous, are in response to a surge of import. And so it's very important to account for this anticipation effect. And you do see some data where you have some anticipation of tariff, for instance, in the last quarter of 2025, 2025, you have an increase with some substitution in the US importer. So, okay, Antonio's 3 questions.
Okay. All right. Okay, so Antonio, one is about the import over GDP stable. That's correct, more or less, but if I understand well, this is an unconditional statement, and we do find that conditional on suitably identified tariff shocks, imports actually fall. The import over GDP ratio falls. So again, I don't think that this, so ours are all conditional statements. Your statement is unconditional, and to explain, so there are lots of shocks going on, lots of policies that can, in the short run, in the long run, that can explain why based on given preferences, that the import over GDP ratio is stable. So, but I think this is not crucial for not a crucial moment that we have to explain. The tariff index, we don't construct the tariff index, so we rely on previous work by Martin and Stephanie, and also other related work. So there are 2 types of indices. One is more elaborate, based on some welfare theory indications, and others are actually based on measures based on actual duties. So those are weighted, appropriately weighted across countries, and so. But again, here we use 3 different indices for robustness. We don't innovate, so we can discuss on other possibilities. The anticipation. So to be clear, the identification strategy is not contaminated by anticipation. So that's the beauty of the narrative approach, right? You identify, given dates or quarters where a given index of tariffs has changed in a detectable way, right? And then you take a statistical approach. So that means, an appropriate rotation of the VAR, so that you attribute to that a given change in tariffs most of the variation of the forecast error change in the tariff index. So that's the methodology. But in that we are completely consistent with the methodology of Rubio Ramirez and Antonin Diaz.
Great, Şebnem. Oh, Pierre, you want to? Okay.
Yeah, thank you. It was a very interesting paper and discussion. Thank you very much. I have two questions, one about the mechanism, one about interpretation. So my intuition is that in a standard incomplete market model, if the US expect high trade surpluses, the NFA will improve, which will reduce the premium on the dollar and to act to appreciate the dollar rather than depreciate. So it'd be useful to clarify under what condition
it's the opposite.
You get that. The interpretation question is simply, I wonder about the emphasis on uncertainty. It seems to me that it's about the persistence of the shock, transitory versus persistent. In fact, if people expect a shock to be persistent, under your mechanism, the dollar would depreciate even under perfect foresight, right? So the question is if it's about uncertainty or it's about persistence. Thank you.
Yeah, okay, thank you. So on the first point, I think, if I understood well, it's kind of the opposite, right? So through the intertemporal budget constraint, if you expect the present value of trade balance surpluses to increase, the present value, so you expect future trade surpluses, you borrow against that today, and that contributes to the depreciation. That's the mechanism, even under certainty, right? So and then you say, right, so the mechanism, of course, goes through comparing temporary versus persistent shocks, fair enough, but here we find first, more realistic in a model that agents, firms, households are uncertain about the persistence, and that they misread some of the shocks as more persistent than they are. Okay, that's the key. And you might say, well, it could be just playing out like a curiosity in the model. Well, we show in the data that this role of uncertainty is important in flipping the sign of the response of the exchange. But you're right that taking the model face value, temporary shocks have versus persistent shocks have different effects through that mechanism.
Okay, Andrei, and then Şebnem.
Thanks. I also have a question and a comment, but mine is going to be more basic, and it's very much related to this last point. The title of your paper has the word uncertainty in it. So that suggests that all the heavy lifting is happening through changes in the second moment of the expected tariff. But then Muhammed told us that it was really mostly about the first moment. And you just talked about perfect foresight, which is all about the first moment. So maybe I just missed something, but it is not clear to me as to whether when you say people are unsure, you're saying people are unsure whether the tariff will persist with very little variance around that expectation, or whether you think Trump is a crazy guy and therefore the variance around any path has gone up. And I thought it was about variance about the second moment, but as I listen to people, I'm more persuaded it's about the first moment, but maybe I'm just missing something. So that's my question. My comment is to reinforce the point you made. If it is, forget about second moments. If it is, go back to a perfect foresight world and think about something that is completely transitory for cap T periods versus something which extends until infinity. Then the textbook model tells you whatever you want, depending on what you put in there. You mentioned one possible source of ambiguity, which is the responsive monetary policy. A second role of, a second channel for ambiguity is the sort of thing that Ricardo had in mind if you have imperfect capital markets. A third channel, which we haven't talked about, is fiscal policy. Some Latin Americans, we think financial crisis, other Latin Americans think fiscal crisis, right? Ultimately, what you're doing is you're changing an instrument of fiscal policy, and it's going to make a big difference what that does to the budget constraint of the government. It's going to make a big difference whether the government rebates the revenue or spends the revenue. It's going to make a big difference whether the government spends the revenue on traded or non-traded goods. So, you know, you make it sound as though we're kind of finding something which the standard model could not deliver. And as you mentioned in your comments, the standard model can deliver pretty much anything if you put enough bells and whistles into it.
Okay, so it's great to get comments from my very first teacher of international finance, Andres. Thank you, Andres, because I think you generated my passion for international macro at that time. Although the way you would call us at the beginning of each class was "Good morning, happy campers," and then start your class. But anyway, so the two comments are very valid. First and second moment. So to be clear, these are not second moment shocks to tariffs. Okay, so these are first. Shocks to the level of tariffs, but the level of tariffs has two components, a transitory or noisy and a persistent component, what we call, and that persistent component as a variance, okay, as an autoregressive process with some variance. And so that's what we call trade policy and structural trade policy uncertainty. And the second moment, I totally agree. So in fact, meaning which textbook model delivers appreciation? I would say a simple Mickey Mouse reasoning, sort of expenditure switching, or a change in the relative price of one currency versus the other. But all other factors, general equilibrium, other policies, even in a simple intertemporal model that we use these days, can give you appreciation or depreciation. So, and monetary policy, I have a paper on that. So I agree. So, and probably we should revise the emphasis. It's not probably that we are turning the textbook model on its head, because I would say in standard models with all bells and whistles, you can generate many different effects on the exchange rate. So that's a point well taken. Yeah.
Okay, great paper and great discussion. So I would like to get back to this. Okay, first, let me actually ask my broad question in terms of how much we don't know about the past, what Dima said in the empirical literature, and how much of that not knowing now we can clarify by looking at the Liberation Day episode versus the 2018 episode, right? So, and versus the past, because I think one of the strengths of your paper is putting this as, look, we can go back to 1990s, there was always a depreciation component and an appreciation component. We can just write whatever model to justify it, but which one is getting stronger? And that goes back to this regime change point you made, Basile made, Muhammed made, right? So are we really now in this world where not just Trump 2, but Trump 1, Biden, US is a more protectionist country because now trade is a geopolitical tool. They are mimicking China. Okay. So in that world is, that depreciation component is always going to dominate because agents are always going to be confused about is this shock is transitory or persistent, which is your mechanism, right? So can we get more at that, like maybe doing without the Liberation Day, without 2008, because in 2018, there's empirical literature that shows 2018 tariffs led to appreciation, 5% dollar appreciation, right? So it's kind of, that's my first question. Can you do more to really look at many episodes and see what is it that, if we have both the depreciation and appreciation thing coming, and is it really this regime change now on steroids that is going to give us, with the next shock, we should expect, more depreciation, like a predicting exists. And my second, so this is a question, if you can do it. My second thing is a point going back to what Andres said and Ricardo said, and also, Dima partially. Okay, if we think the depreciation comes from the financial channel, And you answer these questions like, look, we have a UIP wage, you know, the kind of the more borrowing goes there and all that, and we can justify it many class of models, Okay. But I think if it is really a financial channel, I think you want to do more there, because this is not a modeling thing. Yes, we can all model this, but it is more like an empirical thing, right? What is behind that UIP wedge? And that goes exactly what Ricardo is saying, right? And that's an endogenous wedge. So we cannot just say, oh, I'm just going to shock it exogenously. I'm just going to do some noise thing there or something wrong with intermediation. We can't really say that, right? If we really want to go back to the financial channel. And then, okay, what is the endogenous thing behind that UIP wedge? And again, linking back to your regime change, is it really now a world if we need to be thinking dollar as a risky currency and really think there's a proper financial risk premium as we think for the peso and as we think for all the emerging markets. So that I think is important to come back full circle.
All right, so as expected, those from Şebnem, these were great comments. So you talk about regime change. So as a big picture, I think that's precisely the hemisphere in which we think the paper can be placed. So that's sort of the overall idea, that we have. Based on what you've done so far, for us, the idea of a regime change is in terms of uncertainty on globalization uncertainty on the underlying trade policy by the U.S. maybe driven by geoeconomics, for example, right? That this is now it's a new word that everybody uses that sort of puts a lot of surrounding uncertainty of what is a trade policy regime these days, right? And so I think that's I love this interpretation. And I think we contribute a little bit to put emphasis on that with the results. The financial channel, you're also right. Two aspects to this. First, we can do more and easily to actually say more on this alleged financial channel in the VAR, in the empirical results by looking at some asset price. So whether there is any reaction there. So my sense is this is probably going to find something there because we do already see a very significant reaction of macroeconomic uncertainty, okay, the Jurado measure that we insert in the VAR, and I would expect that some measure of some financial variables will tell us more about that. So that's something we can do. Whether we want to do more, whether we can do more in terms of regime change, okay, that's a very good point. I don't know if we can do it for this paper, but it's definitely. I like this idea of explaining exchange rate reactions or also other variables based on something more fundamental about the uncertainty of the regime being changed, whether it's in terms of finance, whether it's in terms of trade policy. I'm not sure whether we can discriminate, but it's actually a great point. Yeah.
Thank you. So I just suggest we take these two questions together. Alejandro, you first, and then
perfect. So I really enjoy your paper, and I'm surprised. About your measures of uncertainty and how they explain what we saw on the exchange rate. But listening to Ricardo and to, many of the speakers, I think, the difference between a financial channel and an independent financial source of uncertainty, I think it's at the core of this discussion. Now, to what extent, together with the stupidity of Liberation Day, people started thinking Mar-a-Lago is possible. So a default on treasuries held by central banks is possible. And I think with financial market data, you can tease that out and would be very interesting. And I think other things that you can tease out from asset prices, etc., is maybe what I think Andres was saying. To what extent it is tariff uncertainty or tariff dispersion and effective tariff dispersion. If Chinese imports to the US went down from 22% of total imports to 9%, there was an implicit tariff on Chinese imports that is huge, and it might be creating a relatively large distortion in the US economy that might lead to a depreciation in a more complex model. And that's not uncertainty, it's dispersion. So maybe with asset prices, you can, maybe not for this paper or part of that for this paper, but for another paper, read out between channels, independent sources of uncertainty, and how they are correlated with the measure that you have identified in this paper.
Please.
Yeah, all right. Thanks. Very great paper and great discussion. I also have a comment and a question that's become the standard. The comment is, the comment is basically, it's a very important question in the sense that the puzzling behavior of dollar exchange rate since the announcement of tariff has been like drawing a lot of attention. So this paper providing one explanation is great. But I just want to say that although that is the event that draws our attention to how exchange rate reacts to tariff policies, but actually this is a general theory of how exchange rate reacts to tariff policies. In that sense, I think if we can get evidence from other countries, I just realized that would strengthen the identification and also the mechanism a lot. But I just realized that trade index is not readily available for other countries, so I'm not sure how much work that is. But I think in general, if we can find even anecdotal evidence of, for example, there's trade disputes between Australia and China. When that happens, what happens to the Australia exchange rate? Then that gave us some more sense of how exchange rate should react. And the question is a simple question, but I think you mentioned that dollar tend to appreciate in high STPU states, but I think the STPU was much higher in Trump 1 than Trump 2, but most of the depreciation actually happened in Trump 2. So I'm a bit confused, what's the relationship between these two episodes?
No. Okay, so let me just clarify. So maybe we can talk about this later. So to be sure, the exchange in response to increase in tariffs, the exchange rate depreciates when trade policy uncertainty is high. That's the result in the data and in the model. The financial source of uncertainty, I think this is a different, this I'm totally sympathetic. It's sort of a complementary channel to what we identify. We don't explore that. I'm totally sympathetic to the idea that especially in the last two trade wars, or even more with the Liberation Day, the financial channel might have been particularly important in explaining the reaction of the exchange rate or of other variables, but we don't specifically wrote the paper on that, okay? But I'm totally sympathetic that that channel in this very last episode especially might have played an important role. Here we tried to look at a much longer sample, although not too long, so identify a more general channel, if any. Okay, but I'm sympathetic to the idea that especially in the later period, this abrupt move from, even starting with Biden, this abrupt move from a world of low, stable tariffs, globalized flows of trade, to a fragmented world, okay, may bring a lot of weight to the financial source of uncertainty type of explanation. And you're right that it would be very interesting to get evidence from other countries. Unfortunately, these measures, we didn't contribute. We use this; they are available. They're very easy, and it's for an important economy. But that's something that can be done, and actually would be very useful to do. Yeah.
Okay, we have come to the end of this session. Fascinating. So thank you very much.
Thank you.
This was Okay, welcome to the next session. So now we're moving to monetary policy, and I'm very much looking forward. I think Martin will start, and then Nicolás. Is that right? Please, floor is yours.
Okay. So thank you very much for including this paper in the program. I have to, so it's great to be here. I knew Venice, but I had never been at the Venice International Universities. It's great to be here. So the first thing I have to say is this disclaimer that this paper doesn't reflect the views of the IMF. So the okay, so the starting point of this paper is the narrative or the observation that inflation targeting countries that have a history of populism, especially those who have a history with left-wing populism, have a tendency to create or to erode the independence of the central bank. And one of the ways that materializes is with excessive credit of the central bank to the treasury. And even controlling for the primary deficit, that creation of credit from the central bank to the treasury ends up being inflationary. So at the end of the day, the country ends up with inflation and with very low credibility in the monetary institutions of the country. So what we do in this paper is ask the question of how does that kind of history for an inflation targeting country affect the way in which the country conducts monetary policy. And in particular, we are interested in knowing whether that kind of history leaves a scar, a credibility scar, in the sense of having to be more hawkish to achieve the inflation target. That is to say, a country with such a populist history, is it true that it has to be more aggressive in its reaction to inflation than a country that didn't have that history in order to achieve the desired inflation target? The way we are going to proceed is exactly in the order in which I mentioned. That is to say, we are going to provide econometric evidence showing the association between populism, especially left-wing populism, and credit of the central banks to the treasury. Then we are going to show that that creates inflation. And finally, we are going to, and this is the main contribution of the paper, we are going to show that if we model monetary policy in these inflation targeting countries in a flexible way, especially in a way consistent with the Taylor rule, adapted for emerging countries, for open economies more than emerging countries, we show that countries with a history of populism are indeed more aggressive in their reaction to inflation. That is to say, they carry that weight of having had that experience, casts a shadow that lasts a long time. So this paper links a number of literatures. The first one, of course, we focus on inflation targeting countries. So it covers the vast literature on inflation targeting. These 2-3 lines don't do any justice to that literature. It does some justice, but not full justice. It also connects with the behavioral literature, especially the empirical behavioral literature that has documented a link between experience learning, in particular episodes of high inflation, and long-lasting effects of those episodes on inflationary expectations. It links also with the more traditional literature on fiscal deficits and inflation, and its more recent incarnation, the fiscal theory of the price level. And it also links to a literature that has tried to identify economic outcomes linked to populism, how populism can lead to certain economic outcomes. What we do is kind of link all of these literatures and shed light on the effects that populism can have on the conduct of monetary policy, even for successful inflation targeting countries. So the referees, the discussants, and here I want to especially thank Linda and Luminita for very good comments, for taking the time to read our paper very carefully. And they really gave us a push to try to provide the simplest possible theoretical framework that can convey the message that our paper is trying to highlight. And the way we are going to do it is going to be really to go to the very simplest possible way to do it, at least in our the way we think about it. And this is going to be the standard Nukensian model. The first equation is of what is called the expectations augmented Phillips IS curve, which basically says that output growth is a negative function of the expected real interest rate. Here, y is the output gap, pi is the inflation gap, the difference between inflation and the inflation target, and I is the deviation of the interest rate from its intended steady state. The second equation is the Phillips curve that says that the inflation gap depends on the expected inflation gap and on the output gap. And the third equation is a monetary policy rule. We, in the paper, think about flexible inflation targeting as embodied in a Taylor rule. Here, to make the point as simple as possible, we are going to assume strict inflation targeting. So we're going to assume that the government does whatever it takes to keep that inflation rate at target. So under rational expectations, obviously this model doesn't have any shocks, it doesn't have any state variable. So the solution is the steady state equilibrium, what is called the steady state equilibrium. So all variables are at their intended levels, the output gap is zero, inflation is at target, and the central bank doesn't have to move from the steady state level of the interest rate, right? That is a trivial result. We then take from our reading of this empirical literature on experience learning an expectation formulation in which expected inflation depends on whether the country had an experience with high inflation, pi high, and whether the country had an experience with populism, p. Here, p, you can think of p as a 0-1 variable, or you can think of p as a continuous variable with it measuring the degree to which the populist experience was, willing to erode the degree to which, or the extent to which it was able or willing to erode institutions, including economic institutions and monetary, in particular monetary institutions. In any event, we assume here, also in line with the empirical literature on experience learning, that these expectations fade over time at the rate lambda. So in this case, pi high occurs in period 0. The populist regime occurs in periods minus tau. And we want to think of minus tau as being, tau being positive, so minus tau being negative, so that the populist regime occurs before inflation, but that doesn't matter. The importance here is that these expectations may erode slowly, and what the behavioral literature tells us is that lambda is very close to 1. So what happens if in this very, very simple model you plug that expectation formation hypothesis into the model? So you start by, for example, plugging that into the Phillips curve, and you immediately get that if the government, as in the previous model with rational expectations, the government is committed to keeping inflation at the target, what you get is that the output gap is going to be negative throughout the transition. That is to say, if the government wants to keep inflation at its target, it has to produce an output trajectory that is always converging from below, so it's always below full employment. And why is that? Well, that is because in the new Keynesian model, expected inflation is directly linked to current inflation, because expected inflation in the new Keynesian model is basically the expected present discounted value of deviations of marginal cost from steady state. So if expected inflation stays high because of this experience with populism and with high inflation for a long period of time, that is going to create inflationary pressures. If the government wants inflation to be a target, the only way to achieve that is by cooling the inflation enough to achieve the inflation target. The larger is the deviation of expectations from target, the biggest is the recession that the central bank has to produce. So this deviation of the output gap from full employment depends obviously on the magnitude of the high inflation episode, on the magnitude of the populist experience. It depends on how sticky prices are. That parameter kappa there, the smaller kappa is, the more sticky prices are. And its persistence depends on how slowly these memories about this experience fade with time or decay with time, this parameter lambda. So now if you say, okay, so that is what has to happen with the output gap, but what is the monetary policy that makes that possible? Well, in order to get that in this very simple model, you just plug the expected inflation hypothesis that I postulate in the first equation, and you plug the equilibrium output gap that I show there, and you plug those two into the IS curve, and you get immediately, in this very simple model, the trajectory of the nominal interest rate. And what you get is that the nominal interest rate has to be high throughout the convergence to the steady state. So the central bank has to be hawkish throughout the transition, just because it had that experience with high inflation, and that experience stuck in the memory of people. It's as simple as that. There's plenty of evidence that this experience learning is relevant. What we contribute in this paper is the econometric evidence that these experiences indeed affect the conduct of monetary policy. which is something that had not been done before, and that is captured in this last equation. So the main results of the paper, which Nico is going to get into, is to document econometrically that this effect that I'm showing here is statistically significant. It's something that we should worry about. So it talks a lot about the long-lasting effects of populism. So it's not that you have a populist government and then you move to good conduct of policy and we can forget the past. That experience lingers for a long period of time, and Nico is going to try to convince you of that.
So, based on this conceptual framework, empirically we do essentially two exercises. The one is looking historically to try to document this association between having populist regimes, and particularly left-wing populists, that's what we find, with stronger reliance on central bank financing of the government. And as traditionally, we also find that this higher level of central bank financing, or fiscal monetization, if you will, is associated with higher inflation. But building on that, then we see how that affects, as Martin was saying, the conduct of monetary policy in the 21st century, and we focus on how populism affects the legacy of those populists into inflation targeting central banks. So the first part, the left-hand side is the growth rate of claims of the central bank on the government. The key variable, I mean, we have country fixed effects, we have time fixed effects, we have the primary balance, but the key thing is the role of populism, as brought by Beta. And then we split that into what's the role of left-wing and right-wing populism. And essentially, with this in mind, we're going to show that these effects are important. How do we do this? We use local projections model, but we take advantage of this new proposal by Dube et al., which is kind of a diff in diff of these local projections. The beauty of this is that all the results are comparing populists to non-populists. So what's the difference between these two? And it has what they call the clean controls. So basically, the country with the populist that is in the control would be the non-populist would not have had a populist 5 years prior to the emergence of the populist in country X and into the projection horizon. And also there are clean treatment in that when there's a populist, it's because in that country there has not been a populist at least 5 years before that.
Are you going to tell us what the definition of a populist is?
I'm going to tell you, yes, when I describe the data, yes. And Antonio and Alejandro will tell you more tomorrow. The second exercise is standard Taylor rule panels. In the Taylor rules, we control. We have, given the persistence of this process, as is usual, we have the lagged interest rate. We have the U.S. interest rate also lagged, take into account global financial conditions, but in one of the robustness we use time fixed effects. Given that in the sample we have advanced and emerging economies, we control for changes in the exchange rate. The key thing, if you go to the equation 5, is looking at this Z. We have several things there. Some of which we use just for robustness, like financial integration, financial deepness, trade openness. But the key ones are past, as the past inflation, past exposure to populists, and past central bank financing to the government. Because again, we want to focus on the additional effect, on the marginal effect of the exposure in the past to these events, how that affects the reaction of monetary policy today. And we find that strong evidence there, we think. And then we also, that's the legacy part, we also have some amplification effects, what's tried to be done in equation 6, which, given that, if we look at periods of larger dispersion or disagreement in inflation expectations, for which we have a subset of, for which we have the data, today, that effect is further enlarged. So the data, for the first part, we have close to 50 countries going back to 1960. We ended 2008 for a reason, and that's a data reason, is the claims on the Central Bank data, which is from the IMF. It used to be a non-standardized data until 2008. We have this data to 2020, but that goes back only to 2000. So we prefer to stick to that for the claims on the Central Bank, which we have the history, which we want to exploit in the first part. In the panel regressions, we have 32 countries which inflation targeting regimes of the Central Bank policy. For F, again, I mentioned already, but the keys that I wanted to focus on is on past inflation, past experience with populist regimes, and past episodes of Central Bank lending. Expectations are coming from consensus economics. It's corrected by Brito and Carrier methodology to try to take into account the projection horizon. We use central bank data from the BIS for targets, from the IMF. Most of the macro data is also IMF. Populism, your question, we use the database constructed by Funke and co-authors. What is that? For those that may not be familiar, essentially is it relies conceptually on the definition of populism by political scientists, on being the populist leader being someone that comes to defend the people against the elites, the bad guys, which is general enough to account for left-wing and right-wing populism. The bad guys would change, usually in the traditional sense of left-wing populism. The elite could be conservatives, could be neoliberals, could be the IMF, could be whoever is foreign, whoever is abstracting their supposedly what's left-wing redistribution populist. Right-wing populist is mostly concerned with more cultural populism, like but the elites or who they are fighting against could be foreigners, could be different religions, could be those type of agents. But conditional on that, Funke what they do essentially is they look at broadly at social sciences, second-hand identification of populists, for which they are able to collect data going back to 1900s. So we take their data for populism, and this is one of the key variables, as I mentioned. And what do we understand for high past inflation is we take the data starting in 1960 or whatever first observation is available, and up to 10 years prior to the implementation of an inflation targeting regime. So we take the average of that. We compare that to the distribution. Here we create a dummy, takes a value of 1 if it's above the 75 percentile. In previous work that we did with Martin and co-authors, we did it for different, focusing on a slightly different question, but on the past high inflation only, but we did it for continuous inflation, for different thresholds, and all the results hold. And we have some other controls that comes from central bank independence or financial development and openness. So what do we find? The first part, looking at what's in the aftermath of a populist. If we look at all populists together in panel A, what we see is that on average 10 years about, here I show it, but even after 10 years, you have about 100% higher growth, cumulative growth of central bank lending to the government compared to non-populist, but the statistical significance is quite weak. Why is that? Well, when we look at right-wing populists, apparently that's essentially zero, and if anything, it tends to go to reducing the reliance on central bank lending to the government. And when in panel C you look at left-wing populists, there seems to be a much stronger case. It's stronger also statistically, and tends to be that accumulated over 10 years is like 300% larger increase in the nominal claims of the central bank on the government compared to non-populists. We built a case of extreme or abnormal, we call it, central bank lending, which is essentially creating a dummy for those cases in which the growth rate in central bank lending is above, larger or equal to 2 standard deviations above the mean of each country. And we see how this is associated with populism. And if you look at column 2, you see that the years or the length of the populists in power is negatively associated with right-wing populists and positively associated with left-wing populists. Moreover, we control from growth rate of central bank government in periods T-1 and T-2, and those results remain there. And even when we try to, and this is kind of transition, if you will, to the next results. What does matter the most? Is it contemporaneous populists, or is it more what comes from the past? And we control for dummies for the populists in T-1 and T-2. And there seems to be that most of their traction comes from the years of populists, of left-wing populists, up to 3 years before the episodes of abnormal central bank credit. So there is a likelihood, again, on these types of government relying. I mean, you're more likely to see very high levels of central bank credit growth when you have left-wing populists. And this is closing this part. And in traditional, go back to Sargent and Wallace or earlier, probably. I mean, what's the association between lending of the central bank and inflation? Of course, is positive, whether we use the continuous variable or just focusing on the high credit episodes, this abnormal central bank rate. It may change the level or the durability, but essentially there is a clearly positive and strong association between more reliance on central bank credit and more inflation. So the story seems to be that particularly for left-wing populists, they tend to rely more heavily on central bank lending, and eventually this will be reflected in higher inflation. Now, 3 minutes. 3? Okay, I'll go fast. So let me just anecdotally, if we look at central bank independence indices, what we see is that not having a populist is associated with lower central bank independence. They don't need it. It's like our reading, at least, is that this kind tends to having experienced left-wing populists results in the need to have more central banks to try to get away from that legacy, which is the following. I mean, when we look at the inflation targeting central banks, let me quickly, but I mean, if you focus on the inflation gap, the association is positive, and the first column is coming from the previous work that we did with Martina co-authors. The interesting part comes when we look at the interaction of that with past central bank lending, the dummy for these abnormal events. It's further positive, and it's like 80% larger. So the exposure in the past results in today central banks being more aggressive in responding to these deviations, and I should have defined deviation of inflation expectations from target. That's our inflation gap precisely. Not only that, but if we go to the following columns, we see that that's also the case when we look at past inflation. If you experience more inflation in the past, high inflation, again, you're more likely to react strongly. If we look at having a left or right-wing populist, having a left-wing populist also is associated with having a stronger reaction. When you put all together, and probably it's easier to see here, what we see is that on the one hand, you have the reaction, the 136, the standard thing of reacting to inflation deviation from gap, but that is further larger when we look at having experienced high inflation in the past, and furthermore, when you were exposed to having a left populist in your past. Number one. Number two, how about the amplifiers? As I mentioned, if we look, conditional on that, if we look at being more discrepancy in terms of inflation expectations, this is a shorter sample, because not all have all this variation, but for those for which we have the data, we construct the coefficient of variation, I mean the dummy for the coefficient of variation being larger than the median. We also look at the range standardized, and essentially what we find is that if you experience more dispersion or more disagreement about inflation expectations, this triple interaction becomes it's positive, so there's a need for further reaction. Or we look at the acceleration by changes in inflation, and again, this is associated with a larger reaction function. Am I 1 minute? Perfect. Okay. So what we do here, we do a bunch of controls. We put all these variables that I mentioned before: financial integration, financial openness, trade openness. All the results do not change. We have different set of fixed effects. The results don't change. So, in short, what we think, what we provide here is revisit the historical link between populist central bank lending to the government. We find that there is that central bank lending increases substantially in the aftermath of having populist leaders, particularly left-wing ones, and we document that this central bank lending is associated with higher inflation. But more importantly, the legacy that they care, that today's central bank that were exposed to high inflation keep on reacting more stronger, but particularly, I mean, it's populist or high inflation, and is both. So in a sense, it's not only having experienced high inflation, there's an additional kick in the reaction function today because of governments in countries that were exposed to populist governments. Let me stop here.
Okay, great. Thank you.
Okay, well, this was a really enjoyable paper to read and discuss. It brought me back to many, many years ago when I was an undergraduate. I studied political science, and I thought I wanted to be a political scientist. I studied international relations, and sometimes I regret now, with all these issues around geoeconomics and all of these political things that are entering the discussion, I think, wow, it's great to see political science like merging with economics. Wish I had studied more political science as a PhD student. That said, this paper also reminded me how hard it is when you want to bring in political variables and history, and you want to do things like measure things like populism, and you want to come up with causal linkages between things. It's challenging. So I say all this because I want you to take the comments I'm going to make not as criticism, but really to kind of just sort of unearth some of the data that you have to deal with and the challenges to try to get at these very important issues that the authors are tackling. So the motivation of the paper is this rising tide of populism that we're seeing around the world. And this comes from this Funk et al. Paper, which is the source of their data on populism, which I'll talk a little bit about. So you can see this recent rise. One thing I want to note is this recent rise is a bit out of their sample. So we're going to be looking at the earlier period because we don't have variables, we don't have data for some of those later episodes. But nonetheless, populism there's a rising tide, and we are concerned about it, and we want to know how it affects macroeconomic outcomes. The other thing that's lurking in the background is rising public debt. Now there's a lot of reasons for seeing this rising debt. We've got aging populations, we've got the breakdown of fiscal checks that used to work that made us raise taxes when times were good and spend less when times were good and do the reverse. We don't really seem to do that anymore. We seem to not be able to raise taxes to cover spending. We saw this big spike during COVID, which was kind of unavoidable. So that explains part of this rise in public debt. But certainly we were already on that upward trajectory. And now we are facing higher interest payments on the debt. And of course, in this new world that we're in, we're also having governments wanting to spend more on military preparation. So all of this leads one to worry about, how are we going to cover these expenses? And of course, the inflation tax is kind of lurking in the background. And that's kind of what this paper is getting at, is to what extent are we seeing governments facing spending more central bank financing that spending, and then this is leading to inflationary pressures. So there's two hypotheses in this paper. One question is, do populist governments tend to run up spending? Do they tend to rely on credit from the central bank? And does this ultimately fuel inflation? And the second question they want to get at is, having had an experience with populism and high inflation in the past, does subsequent monetary policy then need to be even more stringent in terms of kind of buckling down on inflation? So those are the two key questions that are central to this paper. So I'm going to my comments are really around, what were the data requirements to get at each one of these questions? So, before I get to that. So part one is this link between populism, central bank credit to the government, and inflation. So this came up already is, what's the definition of populism? It's that the leader divides society into the people and the elites, and the leader claims to be the sole representative of the true people. So political scientists comb the literature, and this is the definition they've come up with. What the finding in this paper is that left-leaning populist governments tend to finance this spending are more likely to rely on central bank credit. This leads to more inflation. So the regression is going to be testing for the link between the change in central bank credit after a populist regime has gone into effect. And they use the word regime. I'm going to come back to this in a minute, but the word is like a populist regime. Okay, so here's the data. So this is from Funk et al. I'm sorry, it's probably a little bit hard to read in the back of the room. But this is really what we have to work with in terms of populist governments. So this is the list, and it's about, I think it's 42 countries. And I really like their table because it shows you over what time period the populist regime was in effect, according to their measure. The dark part of the bar is showing you right-wing populism, and the left wing is the lighter bar. So that's the full set of data. That's all we've got. So like much of political science, you have the universe and a lot of cross-country analysis. This is the universe. This is all we can work with, but we're already starting with a relatively small number of countries from which to identify this populist effect. In addition to that, we have a bit of a problem with data. Of course, data puts restrictions on things. So we're going to start in 1960, and then because we've got some measurement issues around 2008, the sample stops in 2008. So we're going to want to look at the impact of this populist leader on fiscal outcomes inside this aperture, okay? And this is challenging because we've got some countries where they don't become populist until kind of late in the sample. So South Korea, Taiwan, Thailand, it was unclear to me whether those stayed in the sample, even though because they had a regime change relatively late, but we don't have much data after that to measure the impact on fiscal outcomes. Then we have other countries that, of course, Germany, Italy, they are before the sample, so they're not going to be reflected in the populist because it's not inside our aperture. The other thing that this highlights is that there's going to be a bit of, I guess I would call it a little bit of oversampling, because there are countries that flip in and out of a populist regime. So it would be Argentina, prior to the sample, we had a populist regime, so I think they're going to be in because you have observations after 1960, and then they have a regime change again, and then another regime change. Brazil. Brazil had a regime change before this period, so I think they're going to be in, but they also come in later. Ecuador also has 3 episodes, so we're going to have, kind of a limited number of countries, and then we're going to oversample some countries because they have, well, I don't know if it's oversampling, but they're going to appear multiple times. The other thing is, we're going to be looking at a distinction between left and right cases. So you can already see if we've got a limited number of cases inside that box, now we're going to be making a distinction between dark and lighter bars. That, I think, leaves us with a difference between left and right wing cases of about 9 left wing cases. So that's a small number. And it's fine. It's the universe you have. I was just sort of surprised when I looked at the regression results. I couldn't quite see how you got the kind of statistical power that you had based on the small number. You have a lot of other variables in the regression, but that doesn't really get you around the low number of observations of the regimes that you have. Okay, so that's part one. That's challenge of part one. They do find convincing results, which are quite interesting. Then part two is this estimating the coefficients of a Taylor rule. And we want to test whether the inflation coefficient in the rule differs for countries that have experienced populism. So we're going to start from the date when the inflation target is established and then estimate forward. So I hope I got this right. I went over this several times. Okay, and then we're going to look at the number of years that they experienced a populist regime up to, you said 5, but in the paper 10. I thought it said 10.
10.
So 10,
Sorry.
okay, 10 years. So I'm going to go back to that original list of countries, and then I took their table where they said these are the inflation targeters, and I put them up here together, and now we're talking about a really small sample. We've got Brazil, 1999, that was when inflation targeting went into effect. So they're going to be in the sample for sure. Chile, no. Hungary, part of the problem is they set inflation targeting in 2001, but their populist government was after that. So it's kind of the reverse. So maybe I misunderstood exactly what you're doing, but I tried to merge your inflation targeting table with your populist sample, and I was just getting very tiny numbers. So it could be I misunderstood, in which case one of my comments will be, I think the paper really needs a clear set of tables delineating exactly which countries are in the sample over what periods. Like, what are your identified kind of shocks to populism? Because I spent a lot of time and got very confused. So if the conclusion here is that I'm confused, that's fine. The paper needs to be clear. Okay, some other comments. So one is, it's already come up, what defines a populist government? So the paper uses regime, government, and leader interchangeably. And I'm not sure they're really the same thing. So for example, Trump is defined as a populist in 2017. It's not in your sample, it's later, but I just take it as an example. I think the US in 2017 was not yet a populist country governed by a populist regime. Now, maybe, right? Now things have shifted. Congress is a different Congress. The Supreme Court's a different Supreme Court. So it's just, what do we really mean to have a populist leader? If you have a powerful Senate, if you have other checks and balances, it's a different thing than if you truly have a populist regime where the whole system is working in concert. And this brings me to my next comment, which is, countries that tend toward populism also tend to have weaker institutions. So are we really picking up populism, or are we picking up kind of weaknesses in those institutions and the lack of checks and balances? Maybe we don't care, but given the heavy emphasis on populism, it's worth thinking about. The other thing that was mentioned is that the definition of populism here, they say in the paper, it's detached from economic outcomes, which it is, the way funky it all do. But I appreciated that you talked about association, because we don't really know, is it that the economic outcomes are the thing that led to having a populist regime, or is it the populist regime that then ultimately changes policy, which then changes the outcome? And again, this is messy. This is history. This is politics. It's messy. The other thing that is not mentioned at all in the paper, and I think just deserves a little bit of, at least for us to think about, not all populist governments are the same, and they don't all do the same thing. And you might think that a populist government that comes into power because people really do want the elites to be smacked down, and they really do want their government to do good things for them. I don't know, is that so terrible? Especially if they spend on things that are good for the economy and good for the electorate. So if they're spending on infrastructure, if they're spending on social services, military, or if they're spending on vanity projects. These all have different multipliers and would have different economic outcomes and probably different implications for inflation and growth. So anyway, it's worth thinking about what's really going on in terms of what the government does. Another related point is, the focus is on what governments say they are. The populists, we say we are this, but what do they actually do? And that's probably what matters for economic outcomes. Picky points, just very quickly. I think it's experiential learning. I think that's the literature, not experience learning. At least the behavioral education literature is experiential learning. So anyway, I think I would correct that. And then, as I said, it would be really helpful to have an appendix so that you could see exactly what countries are in the sample and over what period you're picking up this populist effect. So let me conclude by saying, I think this is a super interesting paper. It's an important topic. I actually believe their results all kind of line up and make sense. I'm a little bit skeptical of how much power you get, and I'm curious about that, but I leave that to the econometricians. I tried to kind of back out, and I then gave up. So I think it's very important to bring knowledge from political science and other fields to our understanding of government policy and its effect on the economy, and I applaud you for this really amazing amount of empirical work that you did.
Okay, thank you. The second discussant is Luminita Stevens, and she will speak to us online, right?
Yes. So first of all, thank you very much for inviting me to discuss this paper. Second, I'm very sorry that I'm...
Just a second, Luminita. We're just trying to get you on screen here. Oh, there she is. Okay, there you are. Okay, great. Hi. Please, the floor is yours.
Thank you. So I'm very sorry that I'm not able to be there in person. So thank you for accommodating me online. Let me just share my slides. So I really enjoyed going through this paper. I think it is very timely. Let me see. So you can see. Okay, so let me start with just a really brief overview and then go into my discussion. So as we already saw, the analysis has kind of two parts. One, an annual panel covering about 50 countries over a fairly long time period. And then the second part uses inflation targeting countries, quarterly data, looking at the period from when they became inflation targeters to 2023. And the key two results are, first, there seems to be this chain from left-wing populists coming into power to a persistent rise in central bank credit, which then is followed by an increase in inflation. And interestingly, right-wing populist governments show no statistically significant results. The second really novel result is that among inflation targeting central banks, those who have this left-wing populist past today respond more to the expected inflation gap beyond having high past inflation. And in particular, they do so more aggressively when there's disagreement in the private sector about inflation expectations or when inflation accelerates. So this leads to this notion of the shadow of populism. And the key takeaways from my point of view are that central bank independence in these countries cannot be taken for granted. And moreover, inflation targeting countries are not homogeneous. Their fiscal and political past shape the rule currently in effect. So as Linda also mentioned, this paper kind of speaks to three big literatures. There's the experience learning and inflation expectations literature in monetary policy. A very well documented result is that experiencing high inflation has persistent effects on people's current inflation expectations. Then there's the large fiscal dominance and inflation literature, but in that literature, inflation targeting central banks are usually treated as a pretty homogeneous group. And the third, apologies for the bullet typo, the political economy of monetary stabilization policy. And the new link here, like Martine emphasized, is that how policy responds today depends on what the public's expectations carry into the present from the history of fiscal and political events. So this is a very timely work that speaks to how aggressively central banks can or must respond to shocks when they have this populist past looming over their heads. So in my discussion, I want to first talk a little bit about the core empirical results. Then I want to talk about how we might understand the mechanism of result 2, and close with an assessment of the success of these more hawkish policies that the authors identify. So on the core empirical results, so the first result, I think it presents a very compelling chain. One word of caution I would raise is, does it operate only via discretionary deficit monetization? So I think that crises often help populists gain power. One caveat to that is I'm not sure if they disproportionately help left-wing populists gain power relative to right-wing populists. But for now, let's just keep going with this line of thought. You might think that a surge in central bank lending reflects stability support in the wake of a financial crisis. That's just a core central bank duty. And so financial crises are episodes that are associated with both an increase in central bank lending, and they are independently inflationary in emerging markets and developing economies. Moreover, these macro effects are highly persistent, and the central bank's balance sheets can remain abnormal for years. So it's possible that if a populist comes to power in the wake of a crisis, we would see these persistent effects that they show in their LP results. Another cautionary note, replacing the central bank lending growth with this abnormal episode dummy that you mentioned might also further isolate precisely to these extreme spikes that are disproportionately crisis related. So it might be that the credit inflation correlation reflects in part this kind of crisis rescue monetization rather than just discretionary monetization pass through. So at worst, I think the paper is showing maybe an upper bound on the discretionary deficit monetization channel. So it might be worth thinking about maybe controlling for crises. The second result, the fact that the populist past affects current policy, is really quite striking. And I think it's really interesting that when the authors control for past central bank lending, past inflation, and past left-wing populism, past inflation remains significant, as does left-wing populism, but the specific monetization channel, the central bank lending, loses significance. So this suggests that the legacy effect might be operating through left-wing populism more broadly, not just isolated to the monetization to inflation mechanism, which I think might be interesting to explore. More importantly, the regressions don't tell us why these central banks are responding more aggressively to the inflation expectations gap today. So what I want to do next is I want to talk about some potential mechanisms behind result 2, kind of break down a taxonomy, if you will, of what might be driving this. So why is there a stronger phi pi? One possibility, which I think is what the model develops most cleanly, is that there's this mechanical stabilization mechanism. Expectations are less anchored because of the experienced past inflation and populist episodes, and as a result of that, larger rate hikes are required to keep inflation at target. Nothing has changed in how the central bank wants to do things or anything like that. It's just the mechanical expectational effects. A second possible mechanism is that there's a credibility or signaling problem that the central bank has to deal with. Given this past, they have to signal their independence and they have to signal their commitment to price stability more strongly than otherwise. So they react more aggressively when inflation expectations go up. One caveat to this is that both backward-looking experience learning and reputation building should fade. So memory recedes, credibility is built up. So over time, we should see the coefficient phi pi converge back down to the non-populist values. But they don't find a statistically significant decay in the response coefficient. And I guess I should say at least not yet. It's possible that the panel is just not long enough. We might start seeing the decay later, but maybe for now, it's not there yet. So these are two, I guess, mechanisms that that one could think of. A third mechanism the paper surfaces is this idea of institutional reform. Past populism led to really bad outcomes, and so these countries redesigned their central banks to a more hawkish stance. This is consistent with the evidence that the paper presents on central bank independence being higher in these countries versus in the non-populist countries. But what's interesting is that they find that phi pi is larger when private sector inflation expectation dispersion is higher. This goes against kind of a fixed Rogoff conservative preference, which would just be constant. It's not that the central bank is expressing a taste. We've now hired an inflation nutter. It's that the central bank is responding to dynamics in the environment, to the second moment, a specific second moment of the environment. So this suggests a fragility of inflation expectations, and or a fragility of central bank independence rather than just institutional reform. A fourth possible mechanism is that this is just reflecting current general EMD fixed effect / general macro stress. Maybe the legacy dummy in this regression is just absorbing the current state. Maybe these countries are subject to much larger shocks and they're using a nonlinear policy rule, and that's what this is picking up. I would also say this is not likely because of this left-right populism asymmetry, which to me suggests it's not generic emerging markets volatility that they're picking up. It suggests fragility specifically through the monetization history, or rather through the left-wing populism history specifically. So I think this asymmetry is a really nice result. The last mechanism I want to bring up is my preferred interpretation, which is that this could be showing us that there's a forward-looking regime switching probability effects. So currently these countries are in a monetary-led regime, but agents put a positive probability on a switch to fiscal dominance. That positive probability raises the phi pi that we need, that the central bank needs today. So this is the shadow of potential fiscal dominance, de-anchoring expectations a la Bianchi-Melosi. And the nice thing about this is that it's consistent with the evidence of monetized past, it's consistent with state dependence, and it doesn't need decay as a support. So it's consistent with there being no decay in this window. So if we step back and think a little bit more about rational expectations options, kind of going away from the experience learning behavioral benchmark and just sticking with rational expectations for a minute, they've already clearly ruled out full rational expectations, known regime, credible monetary dominance, right? So expectations should be anchored. There should be no strong reaction needed as a signal. So that the paper rules out right off the bat for this subset of inflation targeting regimes, which I think is completely novel and important. What they haven't ruled out is these 2 and 3 possibilities. So possibility 2 is, yes, we are in a rational expectations world, but agents have uncertainty about the central bank type, and they update their beliefs from the policy action, and a strong rate response reveals the central bank's type. The third possibility, which is on the table, is this future fiscal regime risk. Agents, again, have rational expectations, but they price a positive probability of future fiscal dominance, and so that's what the central bank is responding to. And I think what's really nice is that we can separate these models empirically using event studies around news. So the same high phi pi is consistent with credibility building, backward-looking experience learning model, and with this regime switching model. So what if we condition on the type of news moving expectations? We can look at realized inflation surprises. If long-run horizon expectations track realized inflation, that is supportive of the backward-looking extrapolative expectations model. If we look at contractionary monetary policy surprises, then we can see signaling or credibility. So do contractionary monetary policy shock compress long-run expectations and lower dispersion on impact? that would support the signaling credibility mechanism. And finally, consider fiscal news shocks, so debt or deficit revisions. Do expectations move a lot after these fiscal shocks, or are these shocks just treated as any old shock in these specific countries? If expectations move a lot after these fiscal shocks, that would support the regime switching fiscal dominant risk. So that's all I had on the mechanisms. Let me now quickly just bring up one point on assessing the success of this higher phi pi. So the headline regression is this reaction function. It tells us that the central bank is pushing more aggressively, but does that aggressiveness pay off? So I think it would be neat to complement the results with an outcome regression. Keep the predetermined legacy on the right-hand side, but then on the left-hand side, put an anchoring measure. So see, compute sensitivity of the long-run horizon inflation expectations to short-run inflation surprises. You can also look at inflation expectation dispersion or the persistence of inflation expectation gaps, or just the inflation gap volatility. Is this more aggressive policy stance anchoring expectations successfully or not? And if you find that they are anchoring expectations, then this is a strength, and this is saying, yes, we have this output loss. It's costly, but it's helping us anchor expectations. If we don't see inflation expectations being better anchored despite the steeper rule, then that's really a symptom of very strong fragility of expectations and of a huge cost to the economy. So in conclusion, I think this is a very timely, important paper. It brings together lots of different strands of the literature that haven't always talked to each other. And more importantly, I think it shows that inflation targeting central banks are not homogeneous. As I mentioned, a larger phi pi tells us that they're being more aggressive, but not why. And to separate channels, conditioning on the type of news moving expectations could be very informative. And finally, the open question to me is, given this past, is this more aggressive policy effective, or is it just costly? And having this this outcomes regression would help clarify that. So that's it for me. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much. Wonderful. So before we come to the discussion, would you like to respond or react?
Okay, I would like to thank again Linda and Luminita for very thoughtful comments and discussions. I want to comment on or respond to the main comment of Linda, which is the question of power. And I think this is a point of contact with Tommaso's and Alfonso's paper, which, by the way, I like very much in the econometric sense. The main identification, the main point of the econometric technique that Tommaso was using, which is this technique by Rubio Ramirez and co-authors, is the idea of using dominant events. And the point that those authors make in that AR paper is that you don't need a lot of dominant regimes to identify the effect that those regimes have on the variable of interest. We use a different technique, which is what Nico explained, which is this diff-in-diff local projection technique. But if you think about those two techniques, they are very similar. They have a similar spirit in the sense that what is important in the diff-in-diff local projection technique is to have what is called a clean treatment and a clean control. And what that means, plainly put, is that if you want to distinguish what happens in the absence of a populist regime and during a populist regime, you need those regimes to be isolated. That is to say, you need that when you have a populist regime, there is no populist regime before it, and there is no change in regime. That is to say, you keep having the same populist regime, at least for the horizon that you are interested in. Otherwise, you are contaminating your treatment. The same with the control. You need it to be kind of isolated. So, if you think about it in this way, the fact that you don't have to think about these dominant effects in the same way that you think about any regressor. That you want a lot of data, going up and down, up and down, up and down all the time. If you had one populist regime in period T, non-populist in period T plus 1, populist in period T plus 2, non-populist, and so on, you actually would not be able to perform a diff-in-diff LP approach. You somehow need to have these events sort of isolated over time. You don't want them to come and go too quickly in your data set.
I'll try to address or respond to some of the points. Thank you very much for all the comments. They're all very good. Let's see. Like Linda said, the data is the data. We have to deal with that, unfortunately. But one important thing is we need to be very specific on the clarity of because we have much more data that we're using, so that will be addressed. And it's true that for us, we use just the same for regime, leader, or government. We rely on the discourse, and I mean, we acknowledge, and that was a comment that Linda gave us in the first part, is that the endogeneity is still a problem, and we recognize that. But that's as much as we can do. That's why we talk about association very, very clearly. On the not governments are the same. We agree on that. I mean, and that's with all the caveats, that's the beauty of relying on what they claim they're going to do, as opposed to what are the populist outcomes or not. And it's true that, and we agree that, I mean, oftentimes it's the claims that populists maybe they are using to get to power are genuine. It's the policies that they implement to try to address that, and how oftentimes politicians take advantage of. But we agree that the claims are often, most of the times, if not all, valid. On the experience learning, we borrowed from the monetary policy learning, so we've been using before. I think Malmendier already is using that, so I'm not a native English speaker, so we're just borrowing. On some of the comments by Luminita, and again, all the comments for both of you are very good. On the crisis often bringing the populists to power, it could be, but it need not. Sometimes it's just they are just growing, and then politicians take advantage of those, but it's not at the crisis. And oftentimes, especially in past, and again, being a Latin American, my bias is that most likely they're used to come as a consequence of, for sure, in the past. Now, the tariff of trade may have helped, especially Latin America, more than in the past. To the extent possible, what we do with controlling for lagged variables tries to minimize that, but again, it's as much as we can do. Let's see what else. On the mechanisms, on the credibility and signaling, there's nice literature by Bocconi, going back also to Rogoff that we mentioned, but that's a point. On the institutional reforms, and there will be a presentation tomorrow that show that in the short and medium run, the institutions do weaken after populism. This is more longer term that we see that if they want to cope with this, maybe like having more independent central banks are things to try to control for the effects of the path in terms of helping the credibility. Okay, what else? I like the idea of looking at this forward-looking regime switching probabilities. So we have to explore that more carefully. One thing is not in this paper, but in the previous paper that we did, Martin and co-authors, we did look at just focusing on how past inflation affected IT reactions. And in that paper, we did control for inflation volatility, for large steps, for many other persistence, and results did not change. I mean, the way we saw it is trying to translate from Spanish is this saying that when you get burned with milk, you see a cow and you start crying. So that's the way we look at this, how this exposure to the past events keep on affecting it. Let me stop here.
Thank you, Nicolás. Tony, is that active?
Very cool paper. Thank you very much. And also two great discussions. I have perhaps two suggestions or comments. The first one is when I see papers, that maybe have a smaller number of countries. My concern is always that whether one country or not dominates the identifying variation. So I was hoping maybe you guys could run some regressions and just drop one country at a time to roll that story out. I think it would be quite useful. And then the other thing is that, just to follow on to Lumi's discussion, in terms of, I was wondering whether or not you can look at longer term inflation expectations within a set of countries to see, whether or not over time these more reactive Taylor rules really do help in making inflation more tamped down over extended periods of time. I know that you can use both financial markets and also the surveys should have that information there. So I don't know if this is something you already done or you can look into. Thanks.
So it's a good suggestion to drop one at a time. We have to try that. On the long-term inflation stages, we don't know. Maybe we have another paper to write in a few years after we have more observations. On the other hand, anecdotally, if we look at Germany, they're still super hawkish. 10 years, 100 years after. So, but at least we have another paper to revisit this in a few years. Thanks.
Okay, Ricardo.
Yes, I mean, at least based on the slide you put there, Martin, on the policy rate, it seems that the relationship between the policy rate and the persistence of memories is non-monotonic. You start from 0 when lambda is 0, and you have 0 when lambda is 1. And so, and I think the reason I was trying to say, why is this? I think is that you have two effects. The one you highlight, the effect of persistent memory on your expected inflation, and the second effect, which is the fact that if memories are very persistent, then you anticipate that interest rates are going to remain above 0 for a very long period of time. And that effect is pushing against your effect. So I think it would be more robust for you. A better left-hand side variable, rather than have the interest rate, is to have long-term interest rates. Because in the long-term interest rate, both effects would work the same way. You see, there was a persistent little change would count as a big change. Well, not. So I think that's a suggestion based on what we have. So check sort of longer maturities. And the second is a reaction to your answer for why you didn't need that many observations. I'm not an econometrician, but it reminded me this very old literature of identifying things with large shocks. Because then the measurement error sort of doesn't really matter because the dominant signal is dominated. But that relies on not only on the signal being a big contributor to that big observation, and that the noise error, whatever is the thing that you're trying to remove, is not growing proportionally with that, and so on. So there is an old literature on these things.
Yes, no, I totally agree with the first comment, and that is absolutely the case. You have that lambda there appears in the standard way of the memory, but you also have the 1 minus lambda there, which is capturing exactly the effect that you are talking about, which comes from the way in which expectations affect inflation, the output cap is inherited in the NK model. And I thanks a lot for bringing that old econometric literature that I'm also familiar with, but I didn't connect to this case.
Okay, Alejandro.
Yeah, two very quick comments on, I think the point that Linda did, distinguishing populist leaders and populist regimes. I mean, that's a problem in our paper that actually we interchange leaders and regimes, but I think it's a very deep issue, and it touches upon one of the channels through which monetary policy might be more hawkish. No, I mean, if the public is expecting the populists to come back, then you're fighting against that, no? And inflation expectations might get an anchor if you don't react as hard as you do, etc. So I think maybe trying to get a measure of the lingering presence of the populist leader or the populist party in the system, even when they're not in power. In the case of Argentina, it's pretty easy, no? But in other cases, it might be tougher, but I think it will give you, I think, an interesting variable to test together with what Luminita was saying, trying to test fiscal shocks, and also maybe test how policy shocks, getting close to an election or not. I mean, if the populist leader is back at play in an election, if your effect is becoming more relevant in terms of monetary policy hawkishness.
We have to, yeah, this is a good question too. We have to explore that. We haven't done it. I mean, we control for the primary balance, which is very weak to address that. So yeah, it's well taken.
So thank you. I also thought that this was very interesting. So take this as a genuine question, and so then this might reflect, might not truly understanding your econometric methodology. But this thought came to my mind when Linda showed the very index of populism taken from the Schulerich et al. Paper. You see this large wave increase of populism in the last 20 years or 25 years and so on. And so the thought I had, those are the years when inflation targeting actually became widespread, right? And I'm thinking, is there a sense in this chain of logic? So your chain of logic is past populism sort of causes some behavior in monetary policy, more inflation targeting leading of monetary policy. But in a sense, you could think that the causation also goes in reverse, right? That inflation targeting policies with all the plethora of and bells and whistles of what inflation targeting is, causes populism, right? And right, there is a sort of a common sense. There is a common narrative that speaks to this. But I'm sure you've thought of this, and I'm wondering whether the econometrics in the paper sort of controls for this feedback effect. So, which is a sort of an endogeneity. I'm sure it does, but I'm just curious to know why, how, yeah.
Okay, so thank you, Tommaso. This gives me a opportunity also to comment on Linda's and the intersection between your comment and Linda's. That increase in populism that you see in that graph is indeed the motivation for our work. It's not playing a big role in the econometric analysis, but I think one point that we are trying to make is to say, is this taste that many democracies are having with populism, just to say, okay, let's try how it is, or does it have lasting effects on institutions? Do they have lasting effects on the conduct of monetary policy? So I think that is something that the paper highlights, but I don't know if we highlighted it enough in the presentation. So what we are trying to say is that what past experiences of populisms are telling us is that they do leave a lasting effect. So, when democracies say, okay, we have had a lot of moderate governments, let's try for 4 or 5 years to see how it is to live in a truly populist environment. That you can do that, but that has a cost. That is what we are trying to say. Now, with respect to your second part of your question, which is reverse causality, I don't know if monetary policy is so important, right? To say, okay, inflation targeting is causing a country to try with populism, which, I take it seriously because for me, Peru is a puzzle. You have this country that is a complete mess from a political point of view. They have had in the past 10 years, I think, more presidents than years. And nonetheless, monetary policy is very stable, is very robust. They have controlled inflation. And this is a country that comes from very bad history in terms of inflation. So I think there is a sense in which your comment is a deep comment, because you could say, okay, so if society says we have the most important macroeconomic problem, at least from a monetary point of view, which is high inflation, under control, and we seem to have it robustly under control, then we could try with a government that does crazy things on other dimensions. But Peru is an exception. But there could be some Peruvian effect in other experiences, not so marked. The working hypothesis in our paper is that our definition of populism is a definition that has nothing to do with economics, and is much more overarching, if you want, and that from that point of view, if there is some causality along the lines of what I said before, that is not too dominant, and you can, conduct the analysis in the way we did. But I think there is, what you are saying, there is something there.
Can I just add a very, so I like your reply. So just to qualify, what probably I had more in mind is that the narrative that people have around inflation targeting policies associated to, this very populist idea of being policies linked to neoliberalism, right? That are applied. A sort of more broadly, not only to contain inflation, right, but for macroeconomic stabilization, but it could be very costly. So it is a very, it's something we can talk about. It's not a critique to the paper at all, right? But I do see that in many respects, inflation targeting is associated to a narrative, okay, of neoliberal policies that against which we are, I think, witnessing a vivid reaction, right, in many countries. Yeah.
In fact, some of the elites are the technocrats. Yeah. So then that will be that. Yep.
Okay, very interesting discussion. We are running out of time, but I still have 3 people on the list. Andres, Şebnem, and who was it? Elias, did you want to say something? Okay.
Okay.
Basile, you also want to say something? We take
No,
the
I will
question
be
one
telegraphic.
after the other, and then you
Great
wrap it up.
paper and amazing discussions, both of them. So thank you for that. I thought on the overall message and a problem with measurement potentially. You described, I think, the political or policy message of the paper very well. You do crazy things temporarily, and you get long-lasting, nasty effects. But I think Luminita's comments invite us to think exactly why it is that they're so long-lasting, and why isn't that you don't get what Tom Sargent used to call a regime change. You know, we would have, you talked about technocrats, everybody in this room is a technocrat. You know, the technocrats would like to think that you change, say, the rules governing central bank behavior, you have an independent central bank, you move to inflation targeting, and it's, a new world out there. And what you're suggesting is that it is not. But then I think, digging a little bit deeper with some of those event studies to figure out exactly how expectations are being formed, how they change with monetary shocks, fiscal surprises, I think that would be really useful. So that's my generic comment. A boring comment on measurement, and this is something that I have done some work on. There are two schools of thought historically on how it is that you define populism. The political scientists do what you did. They talk about rhetoric. If I think that politics is all about good guys and bad guys, the elite and the people, I'm a populist. But there's an older literature, you cited Rudy Dornbusch and Sebastian Edwards. That older literature is completely different. It has nothing to do with politics. It's all about economics. And it's almost, a little bit circular. You're a populist if you behave like a populist, right? And the only reason to bring that up is that I suggest that, I suspect that if you look at history, a lot of the episodes that we historically qualified as economic populism don't necessarily turn up as political populism. So you may be missing some relevant bits in the sample. Historically, not only in Latin America, you had governments which had really crazy fiscal policies. You had monetization maybe in the beginning or later on, but they didn't have this crazy rhetoric. Ronald Reagan was a fiscal populist, but he wasn't a political populist. So I wonder how it is that you take into account those kinds of experiences.
Basile, you want to add a question or comment?
So again, great discussion, great paper, super interesting subject that I know nothing about. So I'm gonna just give me my 2 cents with 2 data points. So on the ECB scene, we see the Germans are being very strict, and we see the Italians are being very lax. And both of them had, what you will qualify a populist government in the 20s and the 30s and the 40s. It's just that in Germany, the rise of that populist government is traditionally more attributed to the bad management of monetary policy and fiscal policy in the Weimar Republic before the rise of the populism. So with those kind of 2 examples, I'm trying to square with your result. Is it something about populism, or is it something that maybe what your discussant was saying, kind of a conjunction of a crisis and kind of, the suffering that follow through a populist regime?
Yeah, so actually half of my discussion tomorrow is about the definition of populism, so I'll defer this part for tomorrow. But I think that conceptually, coming also from work on persistence, I think you are trying on something quite potentially important, trying to connect why events that happened many years ago can have an effect today. So I think perhaps I can give you reference subsequently. I think that's an interesting agenda. I think that you're trying to blend together. However, I think the way I think about this as follows. Let's say that you have hyperinflation by a non-populist. I think Raúl Alfonsín will be classified as non-populist. Unfortunately, the Austral plan didn't work. There was hyperinflation. So shall I think of what Cavallo and Menem did? So Menem actually and Cavallo is interesting because according to some classifications, they are populist, some others they are not. So they have the legacy of hyperinflation, so they have to be hawkish. Why? Because people remember the hyperinflation. Now, there is, I think, a different story if you were to say, look, there is, let's say, chronic inequality, some deeper problem, perhaps going back to Engelman's Sokolov story, then populism is the outcome, which I think is in line with what Tommaso mentioned. Then this populism doesn't work. You have inflation, but being the outcome in some sense of inequality rather than of populism, and then you have a legacy of that. So it's a very hard identification problem because you have like a deep root which manifests one way and then this propels another way. But I think that conceptually you should try to think, because I think also on the theoretical side you are potentially after something very important.
I can give you 1 minute to wrap it up.
So I'm going to take on that last question. So I think the Alfonsine case is an interesting one, but I think you have to start, say, 2 years earlier. I think the populist there and the legacy is the Galtieri. Galtieri was the typical populist. He even liked to bring the people to the Plaza de Mayo. It was us versus the English. We fought the Malvinas, and I think Alfonsine paid that price. So it was part of the legacy. And then the rest of what you said, if you connect what I'm saying with the rest of your interpretation, which is the Cavallo-Menem tandem, I think it more or less fits the story. But you have to start 3 years earlier than Alfonsine to understand what...
This is...
Sorry? I wonder...
No, because it's not democratic.
Not democratic.
But you see, this is a reason why I think you should think deeper, because this says that perhaps a cross-sectional analysis will have a merit, because the time series variation will capture Alfonsine as the non-populist. Well, let's say that before you had like 2 periods where he was classified as democratic, so you have issues regarding the time series properties. But again, we can discuss later.
No, when by chance, Argentina is not an inflation targeter, so then.
Okay.
Great, thank you very much. Thanks to all of you, especially the discussants.